there was a pope way back in 1930, even before I was born, and he saw some trends about marriage that concerned him even then, and he ended up writing a letter about Christian marriage. And what he said in this letter is that if couples want to know true joy in their married life, that couples need to do two things, which sounds really simple, and I guess it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy. And here are the two things that he said: that couples first must meditate upon God's plan for a married life. The idea being, if God made marriage, then he must have a plan for it, just like your auto manufacturer puts a user manual in your vehicle so that you'll know best how it runs, what kind of fuel, and so forth. And so it makes sense for us to think about why God made marriage, why it exists, how it fits within the whole economy of what he's planned. And then the second thing is, with the help of God's grace, and we're going to need a lot of grace to do this second step, because it's one thing to meditate upon God's plan, it's another thing to live it. And so he said, with the help of God's grace, couples must shape all their ways of thinking and acting according to God's plan. So if you think about that in terms of a framework of our day, because I know you probably are thinking, wow, how are we going to spend this much time talking about marriage via webinar? And I think you'll get a sense as we go. It's a big topic, but the first part of our time, kind of the pre-lunch time, that's really where we're going to be doing more of these sort of philosophical, theological, heavy lifting. We're going to talk about God's plan for marriage, why it exists, and so forth. And then after lunch, we're going to talk about something that is maybe not as daunting, but yet more challenging to live, is if the first part is true, then how do we live it out? And particularly, we're going to talk in this particular aspect of your marriage preparation, we're going to talk primarily about how do we live marriage as the sexual sacrament, and the implications of that, and things that maybe we need to rethink and reshape, recalibrate in terms of how we live it out. So that's kind of going to shape our day. Any questions about that at all? All right, so there's I can't remember whether everybody here is Catholic. If you're not Catholic, I want to say a special welcome to you if you're not Catholic, because I know coming to a Catholic marriage preparation class with your Catholic fiance before you get married in the Catholic Church is maybe a little bit off-putting. Maybe you wonder why you're even here. And I want to put you at ease at a few levels. One is that if you're marrying a Catholic, at least through this, you'll have a better understanding of how Catholics view marriage. Second thing is, does anybody know what the word Catholic literally means?
All-inclusive.
All-inclusive, yes. Universal, wide-ranging. It's really about the total truth. And when we understand that word, when we talk about marriage, marriage is not just a Catholic thing or copyrighted to the Roman Catholic Church. A Catholic taps into who we are as human beings, and we're going to speak about universal longings and desires for marriage that I think all people of goodwill can agree on. And then the third thing I want to say is Pope St. John Paul II, upon whom his teaching shapes a lot of what we'll talk about today, he liked to say this about the Catholic faith, that the Catholic faith can never be imposed. It can only be proposed. And to explain what I mean by that, when there probably came a point in your relationship that one of you proposed to the other. Now it's 2020, so I'm not going to assume who that was, but you probably didn't say it like this. You will marry me. I mean, hopefully there was no duct tape or rope involved or any kind of firearms, right? But instead of saying, you will marry me, you probably said those same words, but in a different order. You said, will you marry me? That's the difference between an imposition and a proposal. With a proposal, you were free to say yes or no. clearly you're here today. So at least at some point you said yes, even if you had to think about it. Just kidding. But anyway, proposal means you have the freedom. And so I guess at the end of the day, you're going to hear some things, whether you're Catholic or not. You may hear some things today that maybe you find inspiring or moving about marriage, things you've not considered. You may hear other things that are challenging to you, make you uncomfortable, you're not sure you buy into. At the end of the day, nobody's coming by your house with a clipboard to make sure that you are embracing this vision of marriage. You're a free person. And so please receive what we talk about in this class in that spirit. It's a proposed vision. We happen to believe it very strongly, but at the end of the day, you are a free person. So really what I would ask you is today is to really set aside your preconceptions and open your mind and your heart to a bigger vision of marriage than you've ever had before. I've been married 31 years and some change. Marriage is even bigger than I realize it is, even in 3 decades in. And so part of what you have to look forward to is discovering this amazing thing and to open our hearts and minds to what God means it for it to be if we'll seek his will. Fair enough? All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to each one of you should have a workbook. Let's see. Looks like this. Everybody have that? Hopefully you've got a pen or something that you can write with. I'm going to get us off the full screen. And I have a pen because as we go along, we're going to use this workbook as our guide. You can relax a little bit because probably 80% of what we talk about is actually already in the book. But there are wide margins in the book if you want to take notes or anything like that, or write notes to each other about how boring this is or whatever. You have that there. You also have some blanks that we'll fill out as we go along. That's not really to insult you. I know people can take that way. Just relax. It's to keep you engaged, pun intended, right? And then out to the right of the column, you'll see some page numbers. Those are actually page numbers that reference this book, Good News About Sex and Marriage. And so we're not going to go through this book today, but it's a great accompanying text. I would encourage you to read it before you marry and talk about it. It's very user-friendly because here's the thing. You're going to leave this seminar today with more questions about marriage than you had coming in. And so that text will help you dig deeper into some of these issues and questions that we're going to talk about today. And so we're going to go to page 5. And by the way, you don't have to wait for, if you've got if nature calls or whatever, don't wait for a break. By all means, don't be compelled to ignore that. But we're going to try to go through this. We'll have a lunch break at a certain point, and sometimes actually when you also individually reflect and also discuss your reflections with each other as we go along. So we're on page 5. God's plan for marriage. In the beginning, male and female, he created them. We're going to talk about the Bible and marriage. Everybody there? Here's the thing. We may not think that the Bible has much to say about marriage, but in many ways, the Bible is a book that from beginning to end is a book about marriage. That's the first blank there on the page. It's a book about marriage. Think about it this way, right? You go to the very beginning of the Bible. What's the very first book of the Bible? Anybody?
Genesis.
Genesis. That's the only book of the Bible that talk about baseball. Did you know that? In the beginning. Boom. That's a dad joke special. And then you go to the end of the Bible. What is the last book of the Bible?
Revelation.
Revelation, right. And Revelation is an interesting book, a lot of symbolism, but at the end, what it really is it is a vision of heaven that St. John the Apostle has. And in this vision of heaven, we discover at the end of it that you have a wedding, that heaven is a wedding. Like at the beginning of the Bible, we had a wedding. What was the wedding at the beginning? The first couple, right? Adam and Eve. At the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, heaven is a great wedding. And in this wedding, you have a bride and groom. And the groom is, I taught a religion, I teach a religion class at Lexington Catholic. I always tell my class, this is always the right answer in religion class. Who's the groom in heaven?
Christ.
Jesus, right? And who's his bride? The church, right? The church is the bride of the Christ. So if you think about a marriage at the beginning of the Bible, a marriage at the end of the Bible, these two bookends help us to understand a lot. And then if you go right in the middle of the Catholic Bible, there's a book there called Song of Songs. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's an interesting book, surprising because it's basically a book of erotic love poetry. If you read it, it's a song back and forth between Solomon and his bride, and it's a very explicit. You'll find it, if you could actually read some of that stuff on the honeymoon. I'm not kidding. So why is this book right in the middle of the Bible? Well, our fathers of the faith, the Jews tried to understand it not only as a celebration of human love, but as an analogy of sorts of God's love for his people. And then the Christians, when they read it and they understood Christ as the great bridegroom, a love song between Christ and his bride, the church. And so we have marriage at the beginning, marriage at the end, marriage in the middle, and that only touches the surface of how marriage is a theme throughout the whole biblical story. And what's the basic idea? It's a clue to help us understand the whole meaning of why we exist, is that God wants to ultimately to marry us. He wants to live in a joy-filled union, a faithful union with us forever and ever. So you'll see that fourth bullet point there, God wants this eternal marital plan to be so obvious to us that he stamped an image of it in our very being by creating us male and female and calling us to marriage. And here's a quote from the New Testament, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, just so you know I'm not making this up. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church. In other words, marriage is a sacrament. That word sacrament is a sign. It points beyond itself to a heavenly reality. And even our bodies, as male and female, point to our call to marriage. And so marriage becomes a physical sign of God's great love for humanity. And we're going to unpack that as we go. It tells us here that our bodies and even our sexuality are not just biological realities. They're theological realities that actually point to God and who he is and why he made us. Turn to the next page. Christ provides the key to a joy-filled marriage. We're going to talk about a little bit here about an exchange that Jesus had with his sharpest critics, a group called the Pharisees, right? And they were always trying to trap Jesus in his words, hold something against him. And they came to him with a very controversial topic, which is not controversial then only, but even now today, the question of marriage and divorce. Because they had picked up in Jesus' teaching a strain that they didn't understand. Jesus talked about marriage as if it were a permanent binding thing. Because in their tradition, received from Moses, the Jews believed that a man could divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever. If she burnt supper or hid the remote control, he could, well, there weren't remote controls, but you get the idea. You know, you couldn't, a man could divorce his wife for any reason. And so they basically tried to sort of bait Jesus into contradicting Moses. And so Jesus, in his response, because they asked, you know, Moses let us divorce our wives. What do you have to say about it? And Jesus said this, Matthew 19:8, a very revolutionary thing, actually. He said, "For your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, it was not so." What's Jesus doing in essence? It's as if he's saying, look, if you want to understand the Father's plan for marriage, you don't need to look at Moses' law. You need to go back before the law, to the very beginning. What did the Father intend for marriage to be before things went wrong and your hearts became hard? I kind of, as an analogy, I drive a 1997 Toyota Camry. I call it my Catholic school tuition car. It's falling apart. That the windows will roll down, but they won't roll back up. The paint's fading, but guys, it has a nice scrape on the side. About 6 months ago, my son-in-law was driving it on New Circle Road, and the tail fin somehow vanished. We don't know what happened. Hopefully nobody was killed. The radio knob is broken. If I wanted to show you what the engineers at Toyota had in mind when they designed the 97 Camry, I wouldn't show you my car. The engineers would be horrified. I'd rather show you one that had been kept in mint condition and atmospheric controlled, storage, whatever. It's as if Jesus is saying, look, if you want to understand marriage, you don't look at the Mike's 97 Camry. Look at what the Father intended at the very beginning. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go now back to the beginning to help us understand what the Father meant from marriage right at the start. We're going to go to number 3 here, created in God's image. We're going to go back to that book about baseball, the book of Genesis from the beginning. And in just a minute, I'm going to ask if one of you would be willing to read this verse from chapter 1 that starts with, "Then God said." But as you know, the first chapter of Genesis is a creation story, right? God speaks and creation comes to existence. God, let there be light, and there's light and so forth. And after everything God makes, God sees that it is good. But there's this sort of crescendo. Things get even greater and more glorious toward the end of chapter 1, where you see the greatest thing God makes. After which he said, it is very good. And what he makes is man and woman, you and me, from the beginning. But here's the thing I want you to think about it before we hear this verse. We get this book from our fathers in the faith, the Jews. And in the ancient world, the Jews were set apart from all the other religions around them because of one belief they had about God. The other pagan religions said there's a God of the crops and of the rain and the sun and the moon. But what did the Jews insist? There's one God, right? And so that was at the heart of their creed and their conviction. There was one God who had no rival. So with that in mind, I want to see if you notice anything strange about this passage from Genesis 1. Any volunteer? Raise your hand if you're willing to read. Bueller? All right, go ahead, Jenny.
Okay. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply."
Did anybody pick up on anything weird in that passage, considering what we just talked about with the Jews?
He said "our" versus "my."
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Let us make man after our likeness. So God speaks to himself in the plural. Now, this has been a big point of argument for literally millennia. What's going on here? Is God speaking to the angels? Is God is this a typo, or is God using the royal we like kings and queens do? Or is there something else going on here? And actually, there have been Christians who've argued for literally millennia that what we have here, to use an old high school literature term, is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing in Scripture of something that we would understand and have revealed later. Something about God. Any guesses what Christians would think this was a foreshadowing of? We have one God, right? In what way, though, is God actually two, in a way, plural?
Like, you're talking about like the Trinity?
Yeah, absolutely. That God's one, but in fact, God is three persons, one God, right? And so what we may have here is a sort of foreshadowing that God himself is a communion of persons, right? And therefore, when God made us in his image, that it only makes sense that he would make us male and female in his image. As this bullet point says at the bottom of the page, this means that somehow in the complementarity of the sexes, we image God. Somehow as male and female, we make visible God's invisible mystery, which begs the question, what is God's invisible mystery? Look at the next page. This is a quote from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Anytime you see those three C's together. God has revealed his innermost secret. God himself is an old man sitting on a throne, hurling lightning bolts at pitiful sinners. Actually, I think that's an old addition. God himself is an eternal exchange of love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he has destined us to share in that exchange. Well, that's beautiful poetic language, but exactly what does it mean? So I wanted to look at an image that can help us understand it. This is an icon. Hopefully you can see this. In the Catholic Church, we're really big on icons. Of course, our Orthodox brothers are even bigger. But icons are basically, is not an image that you look at. You're meant to look through it. In other words, to see the deeper thing that is revealed, right? Sort of like a lens. And this is one of the most well-known icons of the Trinity, this communion of love. You have the three, this is, I think, dates back to the 1300s, a Russian who did this, Rublev. And one thing that's true about an icon is that nothing is accidental. Everything has purpose and meaning. And so one of the things I want you to notice about this image is the prevalence of circles in the image. Think about that. You know, you can see that the halos around the three figures, the divine figures. You can have even the way their heads are shaped are circular. And even if you were to take and go around the posture of their back and down to their feet and around, he's drawn the curvature of their bodies in such a way that you could trace a circle around all three figures. You also have that bowl or chalice in the middle of the table. What do you think a circle is meant to symbolize? What do you think? A circle. What is a circle meant to symbolize? Maybe unity, totality. Maybe we could even say eternity, because you can't tell where a circle begins and where it ends, right? Now, the great thing about icon is the more you look at it, you begin to see things. It's meant to be meditated, reflect upon it. If you can see inside the two figures on either side around their inside shoulders down to their feet, You can see that it forms a chalice, right? This is a communion of love, right? But there's one other circle I want you to notice that's not quite as visible to the naked eye. It takes a little imagination. Now, relax. This is not one of those things that you have to look at until you see a spaceship coming out of it. I suck at that. It never works for me. This is not quite that hard. Instead of just a circle flat on the page, I want you to imagine a circle that curls around their shoulders and extends out three-dimensionally in the imagination of the viewer, like you took a big hula hoop and threw it around the three figures. Now I would ask you, with that circle, who completes the circle? Anybody want to take a stab on that? Who completes that circle that extends out three-dimensionally from the image?
Take a guess and say God.
Well, God, yes, the three figures are the divine Trinity. Let's go even think about it just a little bit more. That circle that's
Image in the book. I'm
no,
just
it's
trying to
not in
figure
the
out.
book. No, it's the image on the screen. Can you see it?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Now I know what we're looking at. Sorry, I had you.
Yeah,
off to one side.
no worries. Sorry about that. That's the challenge of virtual webinars. Look at that image there. And that, imagine the circle that's not just flat on the screen, a circle that curls around their shoulders and extends out in the imagination of the one looking at it. I would say it's you or it's me, right? In other words, we're being drawn into this circle of love. This is the whole message of Christianity in one image, that God himself is an eternal exchange of love. And he has destined us to share in that exchange. In other words, God didn't make us because he was lonely. He was already a perfect, eternal communion exchange of love. He made us out of the overflow of love, and he brings us into that circle of love. This is the heart of what it means to be a Christian. If you ever see a Catholic, maybe on vacation or in a different place, they go to a mass, they walk into a church that they've never been in before, and they come in the door, and it's an interesting phenomenon. I'll try to make it a little apparent. Anyway, they come in a church they've never been into. They come in, they walk in the door. Before they're seated, they may even be half asleep. But it's almost like their hand starts looking for something. They've never been in this church before, but they know that their hand needs something before they head to the pew. They're looking for the water, right? And to touch the water. And to remember what? Their baptism. And how are they baptized? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We're drawn to this eternal exchange of love. Now, what's the practicality for us? It means that at the very heart of our existence is the reality that we were made out of love and we were made for love. There's a great quote here, 3C in your book. It says, man, and here he speaks, Pope St. John Paul II, of man in the universal sense, humanity. Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not experience it and make it his own. Now, what the heck does that have to do with you as an engaged couple? Now, this is different for every couple, and it may have been different from you or may experience it in a different way. But every couple at some level experiences this. There came some point in your relationship where all of a sudden you realized this is the real thing. Maybe I've had other relationships, but nothing like this. I remember when my wife and I were dating, we're 19 years old. We were sitting, we'd been dating about a month or month and a half. We were sitting in a car at night on the side of the road. We were talking, but anyway, we were talking, and all of a sudden it was like this cloud descended upon down upon us. And all of a sudden we both felt it and said it to each other, like, oh my gosh, you might be the one. You might be the one that I spend the rest of my life with. And when that happens, and it may happen differently, it may be gradual, it may happen to one of you and then the other, whatever, but when that happens, it's like something within us comes alive, because it's tapping into that fundamental reality for which we were formed, for love. But it's really important when we reflect upon these things to understand what we mean when we say love. And so we're going to go on to number 4, loving as God loves, because we toss the word love around a lot. I love country music. I love, I love the Wildcats. Go down the list, and then I love my fiance or my wife or my husband. Okay, hopefully the word means different things. So when we talk about love in its most complete and mature form, it has 4 characteristics. You'll see on the workbook on number 7. There are numerous ways to describe God's love, this bullet point, but 4 qualities in particular stand out. God's love, blank 2 here. God's love is free. It's not, manipulated or forced or imposed. God's love is free. Second thing is God's love is total. If you look at, for example, hold on. If you look at a crucifix, right? You don't get any more total than this love, right? Complete abandonment. What's the third? It's faithful. God's love is faithful. Doesn't ever turn away from its beloved or abandon the beloved. And finally, God's love is fruitful. It's the reason we exist. It's generous and it's life-giving. It's generative. So God's love is free, total, faithful, fruitful. Now there's one word that sums up all these 4 qualities of love in one. And it's love. It is the word marriage. Blank 3. Another name for this kind of love is marriage. Or if you've seen The Princess Bride, marriage. People still watch The Princess Bride? I know some of my pop culture references are old. Anyway, marriage, what brings us together? How does marriage sum up all 4 of those qualities of love in one reality? Well, think about it like this, right? So I'll pick on Spencer and Jenny because they're together here. So Jenny, when is it that y'all are getting married?
November 14th.
November 14th. All right. So imagine that if Spencer comes to you about a week before the wedding and he says, Jenny, I know it's going to be crazy busy for the next week. We have a lot going on, but I want you to know and rest assured that down deep in my heart, when we stand up before God and friends and family at that altar, that I'm planning to be 99.5% faithful to you for the rest of our lives. I mean, if you think about that, it rounds up to 100, right? I mean, that's a really high A.
Yeah.
Would you be good with that, Jenny?
No.
How about any math scholars here? 99.9 with the line over the 9. I mean, the mathematicians say that's pretty much the same thing as 100. You good with that?
No.
So what is it you're looking for?
100%.
100%. And is that because you read it in the catechism somewhere that married love is faithful?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, or maybe you just kind of
know
know
that.
it.
That's what I would expect, and that's what I think he should expect from me. So.
Yeah, so when we talked earlier about, the Catholic idea of marriage, the word Catholic meaning universal, these are not copyrighted Roman Catholic ideas. They're rooted in what we know marriage and married true love is. It's not just 99.5 or 9. It's 100%, right? And it's also total. And so when we think about marriage, what we want out of marriage, we want a love that's free, total, faithful, and fruitful. And that's really ultimately what marriage is. And this is exactly what you'll be promising when you stand at the altar. As that bullet point says, this is precisely what bride and groom commit to at the altar and express with their whole selves, body and soul, becoming one flesh. In other words, you're promising to love as God loves. And God designed sexual intercourse so we could mirror his own eternal life-giving love. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But let's go back to the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis chapter 2. And I promise we're not going to go through the whole book of Genesis or the Old Testament today, but these first few chapters are foundational, right? Now, the thing about Genesis chapter 2 that's interesting, it's another creation story. So Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are two different ways of presenting creation, which should tell us from the beginning that we don't necessarily need to be too literal when we read these because they're told differently. And yet at the same time, they tell us in various dimensions some foundational truths of who we are and what married love is about. And so Genesis 2 tells the story just a little bit differently. In Genesis 1, God created the man and the woman together at the end of the chapter. In Genesis 2, God creates the man first. Now remember, in Genesis 1, everything that God makes, he sees that it is good. And even human beings, very good. In Genesis 2, after he creates the man and he puts him in the garden to tend it and care for it, for the first time, God sees something isn't good. Does anybody remember what it is? God said, it is not good.
For man to be alone?
Say it again, Ann.
For man to be alone?
Yeah, exactly. He was made for love. So here he is alone, right? So God's going to remedy that. What's the first thing God does to remedy his loneliness in Genesis 2? What does he create?
Woman.
Not yet.
Oh, wait. Oh, the animals.
He creates the animals, exactly. And he brings he's going to give him a pet, I guess. And he brings the animals to the man and has him do what?
He names them.
He names them. Now, there's a lot here, right? And Pope St. John Paul II reflected on this a lot. He said, yes, he wanted the man to show his dominion over the animals by naming them, because by naming them, you have a certain degree of dominion over them. But the other thing he said is, he wanted the man to see that out of all the creatures in the world, as many and splendid and diverse as they were, that he was utterly alone. He called this original solitude because he was made for love. And the animals, as wonderful as they were not persons, and he was made for love. And so then he goes to God's next strategy. What does he create? He creates the woman. And how does he do it? Anybody recall?
He takes a rib, right?
Yes, first he gives him general anesthesia. He takes, that would really suck. He took the rib after he put him to sleep, and he shaped and formed the fat into the woman. And notice, here's an interesting thing, right? Because the Hebrews or the Jews, there's power in language and words, right? And images. He didn't take it from his heel. He didn't take it from his shoulder, his back. He took it from his rib, which speaks of a partnership side by side from the beginning. But I want you to notice, I'm going to pull this shared screen back up here for just a minute. So when the man sees the woman, right? for the first time, what does he say? Does he say, oh, finally someone to help me with these chores, grab a rake? No, he says something that's poetic and ecstatic. Let's see, hopefully if I can get my screen to work. There we go. What does he say when he sees the woman? And this is actually a reading that could be in your wedding if you chose it. He said, the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, right? This one is bone of my bones and flesh. In other words, someone who is like me. And then there we have this interesting verse. And can anybody tell me what's weird about this verse, considering where we are in the biblical story? That is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body. You might notice something weird about this, considering where we are in the biblical story.
Well, they didn't have parents because
Yeah, exactly. So why does it say it like this? This gives us really an insight into why Jesus pointed us back to the beginning in the first place. It's because this union of this man and woman was not just about them. They were the prototype or the model of what marriage means. In other words, all future marriage would find its meaning and shape in the union of these two from the beginning. And then notice what else it says. How did the two of them become one? Did they become one mentally? Well, yes, but more. Spiritually and emotionally? Yes, but more. They actually became one body. In other words, not only did God make them for love in his image, not only did he give them to each other so that they might share in that love, he gave them two bodies as man and woman. They could quite literally be joined, which, as I like to say, contrary to popular belief, it means that sex is not something that human beings made up when God had his back turned. It's not like God went, oh, what are you doing down there? Breaking it up, you crazy kids. First you eat Tide Pods, now then this. No, it's written into God's design and plan from the very beginning. And then here's this verse, and we're kind of getting back into the textbook a little bit, or your workbook. Pope St. John Paul II said this verse here was maybe the key to understanding the whole thing. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Now, we may read that and say, well, good for them, I mean, maybe they had killer bodies, maybe they bought each other those Pelotonics for Christmas, whatever. Or maybe they were just ignorant and innocent, like when your 2-year-old hops out of the bathtub and runs through the living room covered in soap suds, we giggle. But if your 18-year-old does it, we're a bit more concerned. Well, that's some of that. But Pope St. John Paul II said the reason they experienced no shame in their nakedness is because that second bullet point, they experienced sexual desire only as the desire to love in God's image. In other words, think about what love is like. Love by its nature goes out to the other. It seeks to give itself to the other. It is not concerned with taking and using. It seeks to lay itself down to the other. And in the perfection of their love from the beginning, they could have perfect trust and vulnerability because they experienced that desire for the other as the desire to love in God's image. Not only that, they could see written in their bodies that they were made for each other and they were made for marriage. Now we jump down to number 6. One of the things that we have in the beginning is that God gave the human beings something that he didn't give any other creatures in the visible world. Second, the last bullet point on page 8. He gave them this command about the trees and that they could eat all of the trees except from one, right? And what does it says? Why was this commandment only given to Adam and not the animals? Because the human person is the only creature in the visible world with freedom. Freedom. And freedom is given as the capacity to love, right? We already talked about those essential qualities of love. The first one we listed is free. For love to be love, it has to be free. And so freedom here is given as the capacity to love, to do good, and to avoid evil. And understanding God, for whatever reason, felt that freedom was worth the risk. And that'll jump us to number 7 on page 9. A new entity who enters into the garden equation. And it's the serpent, right? This personification of evil from the beginning. And this original temptation, who actually in his conversation, when we see this picture, we don't know where the man is, maybe watching football or something. And he strikes up this conversation with the first woman. And what he begins to do very subtly and cunningly, he begins to sow seeds of doubt in her mind with whether or not God wants the best for her and for them, whether or not his commands are true and good, or they're only wanting to restrict them. And that in some ways, this original temptation is reflected in every temptation since, because we have this human tendency to doubt God's intentions for us, and that he doesn't want to give us true happiness. As the third bullet point from the bottom on page 9, what's the serpent's insinuation? God doesn't want you to be like him. God is withholding something from you. God doesn't love you. His commands aren't for your happiness. If you really want to be happy, don't listen to God. Do your own thing. And of course, we know that she ate of the fruit. She shared some of her with her husband, who was maybe not the brightest bulb in the pack. He received it. And do you recall what the immediate consequence was of their choice? Anybody remember that?
They realized they were naked and then felt ashamed.
Ah, yes. They realized they were naked, and for the first time, they felt shame. And that shame worked on 2 levels, right? They tried to hide from God as if you can, and they also covered themselves before each other. In fact, the text says, that they were these, they got these fig leaves, right? And so I can symbolically hand them to the women here. And oops, guys, this is all I have left for you to give you. And what did they cover if we read the text? They didn't cover their elbows or their earlobes or their ankles, right? They made loincloths. In other words, they covered the very parts of themselves that spoke of their difference and their call to unity. And what happened is, with top of page 10, first bullet point, what happens? When they disobeyed God, what died was the love of God in their hearts. Void of God's inspiration, sexual desire became inverted self-seeking. In other words, love which seeks the good of the other now became turned in on itself. Rather than seeking to give oneself, they desire to take and to use the other. And in that sense, the shame they felt, in a certain sense, was even self-protective, because they no longer trusted the gaze of their partner. And they no longer trusted that the partner wanted simply to love and not to use. In other words, that shame even had a positive meaning, because it reflected this interior echo that we all have, that we know we were made for love and not to be used. As you see, that second bullet point, lust, therefore, is sexual desire void of God's love It is a reduction of God's original plan. It doesn't offer more, but less. And we cover our bodies in a fallen world, not because they're bad, but because they're very good. And we want to protect their goodness from the degradation of lust. Think about this on a practical term. Imagine you're taking a shower, right? And in your nakedness in the shower, you're not ashamed of your body. You know, your body's good, you know, except that our culture sometimes makes us have these self-comparisons which are destructive. But we don't doubt the goodness of our bodies. But if we're in the shower and getting out of the shower and an intruder busts down the door into the room, we immediately, instinctively cover ourselves. Why? Because I think down deep within ourselves, we know that we were not made to be used or abused. We were the goodness of ourselves was meant to be loved. And you know, at the heart of our Christian understanding of the human being is that this original fall or temptation is reflected in our own experience. And we all bear this original wound within ourselves. And it shapes even how we relate to one another as husband and wife. And it's something that we're going to talk about in chapter 2, what God does to reverse the curse. And we'll come back here in about 5 minutes. I'll give you a stretch break, get a drink of water, whatever, and we'll start back up here in about 5 minutes. All right, so Christ restores God's plan for marriage. Here's the great thing about God is that he doesn't leave us in our brokenness, in our human condition. He provides us a way out. Now, we talked in the first chapter how the Bible is a book about marriage. You know, that you have the marriage at the beginning, you have the marriage at the end, and how we can understand it. You can also think about the Bible is a great love story, right? There's a great quote here. Let's see, boom, Pope Francis. We, the women and men of the church, we are in the middle of a love story. Each of us is a link in this chain of love. And if we do not understand this, we have understood nothing of what the church is. So think about it like this: love stories, romantic movies. I've been married 31 years. I've seen a few romantic movies, not always by choice, but you know, you had to make deals. Anyway, you think about a lot of romantic movies. Oftentimes they'll have 4 basic plot points. Characters may change, the names, but these are the 4 basic plot points. Plot point 1, boy and girl meet, right? Plot point 2, there's something that separates them, either a crisis within the relationship or outside the relationship that separates them. Plot point 3 is there's some act of heroism or sacrifice that brings back them together. And then the last plot point is the boy and girl back together again, but now what they have is deeper and richer than they had at the beginning. Now that grid, that structure works for the Notebook, no doubt. Now think about it in terms of the biblical story. Plot point 1, boy and girl meet. They're in perfect union with each other and with God. What is it that separates them? Sin, right? Which they hide from God and each other. Who's the great hero of the story? Again, always the right answer in religion class. Jesus, right? And therefore, it shouldn't surprise us, as we see page 11. It is of utmost significance that Christ performed his first public miracle at a wedding, right? At a wedding. You can read about it. The text is there in your notebook, John chapter 2. Jesus and his disciples and his mother are at this wedding. And what was the crisis at the wedding? Did somebody need to be healed, or a demon cast out, or somebody raised from the dead? That was a pretty practical need, right? They ran out of
Out
wine.
of wine.
Yeah, exactly. And if you'll read the text itself, who was it that first brought to Jesus' attention that they had no wine?
Mary?
Yeah, Mary. I have a Protestant pastor friend who said, yeah, it was Mary who first noticed they ran out of wine, and Catholics have loved her ever since. It's pretty good. Anyway, so she comes with Jesus with this request, and he does an amazing thing, right? He takes water and transforms it into wine. And if you kind of get in the weeds of the story and do some basic math, it's a pretty incredible thing, right? Because they took these 6 stone water jars, and they each held 20 to 30 gallons. So Spencer, you're an engineer. Each stone water held 20 to 30 gallons, and there were 6 of them. And they filled them up to all the way to the brim. So how much water / wine would that be?
Like a 120-ish.
Yes, all the way to up 180. I mean, this is to people. I actually had a student in my class at Lakeland Catholic this semester, and about a month into the New Testament class, she told me where her dad was from. She said, "My dad's from Nazareth." Now, she meant the Nazareth. He was from Nazareth in the Holy Land, right? And he came in and talked to the class, and he said, growing up there, you went to a wedding, it could last a week, the celebration. So here are these people that have been drinking for who knows how long, probably already sloshed, and Jesus gives them 120 to 180 gallons more of wine, and not just any wine, the best wine. What's going on here? Well, what's the purpose? Not just to help them keep a buzz going, right? There's something highly symbolic here. In fact, it's the reason the church has always viewed this miracle as not just an accident, that there's something going on here. Is in many ways, wine here is a symbol of God's love, blank 2, which could indicate that running out of wine means that without Christ's help, man and woman cannot achieve the union of their lives for which God created them in the beginning. And here's a practical lesson, right? Because, and part of the proposal really of this class is that we need Jesus not just at our wedding, he needs to be in our marriage. Why? You're going to all be so well organized and planned for your wedding reception that you probably will not run out of alcohol at your reception. But here's the thing. I know a lot of marriages that have run out of wine, metaphorically speaking, right? It's been a kind of tough couple of years for me in my friendship circles. People that I've known, that I've seen their marriages disintegrate, some married 25, even 30 years. And what's heartbreaking is to see that somehow along the way, their wine ran out. In other words, they found themselves unable to summon the love they needed for their marriage to endure. And that's really an important lesson for us to reflect upon, because you're going to find as you go through married life that you're going to face challenges that you never expected. Have you ever heard the thing that there's 4 rings of marriage? There's the engagement ring. There are 2 wedding rings. Anybody know what the 4th ring of marriage is? It's suffering. Suffering. I don't say that as a bad joke, right? But to say that if you don't think real love involves suffering, then you need to stare at a crucifix a little bit longer, right? Because true love suffers for the beloved. You've already experienced it, and even in the time you've been together, you've experienced what it is to suffer with each other. I remember my wife and I had been dating about 2 years, and I was leading a junior high retreat in another state, and she was there as one of the chaperones, and I got probably the worst phone call I've ever gotten in my life from my mother, that my dad, who was 49, had a massive, fatal heart attack. And my wife was, well, she was my girlfriend at the same time, at that time. She was there in the midst of my anguish, and she suffered with me through it, brought our relationship to an even deeper level. You've learned what it is to suffer for your beloved, to give up something or to make some sacrifice on their behalf. And I'm sure you've been together long enough that you've experienced what it is to suffer because of each other. Because when you love somebody, then they have the power to hurt you like really nobody else can. And so that suffering in the midst of loving is part of the nature of our lives, and it's going to be the nature of your married life. And without Christ's help, we're going to be unable to overcome it. But only with Christ's help can we find that our wine does not go dry. As that third paragraph from the bottom of page 11 says, Christ came into this world for this specific reason, to restore the wine of God's love in superabundance. That is why the gospel is good news. Turn the page. Christ takes us to the heart of the matter. Here's where we're going to go to probably the most challenging thing Jesus ever said. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. A lot of people hear these words, and maybe specifically men, and they want to raise the white flag of surrender. What is it that Jesus says here? You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at that Victoria's Secret catalog has already committed adultery in his heart. Well, there wasn't such a catalog in those days, but you get the point here, right? And also understand this: Jesus is not just talking to men, but we have this proclivity toward lust. Now, here's where we have to be very careful what we mean when we say lust, because we have a caricature of lust. Sort of it's the old man in a trench coat standing on a street corner leering at women, kind of the creeper. But lust is much more fundamental to our human experience than that. In fact, lust is actually the truest opposite of love. We usually think about lust as being the opposite of, or love being the opposite of hatred, or hatred being the opposite of love. But the truth is, the opposite of love is lust. Why? Well, if love goes out to the other, seeks to give itself, lust seeks to take the other and to use them for our own pleasure or end. And this is something that is a struggle that we all as human beings have, this tendency toward using another person as opposed to giving ourselves to the person. And sometimes it can seep into our relationships in very subtle ways. That's that first bullet point there on this, marriage does not justify lust. Because lust is not sexual desire. Sexual desire is a great good. But lust is the perversion of sexual desire, to where we belong to use another person for our own good and not their own. As it says here, the opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is to use someone. And therefore, if spouses are to experience true lasting joy in their marriage, they must work diligently with God's help to overcome the selfish sting of lust. Now you can read those quotes underneath there, but then go on toward the end of that section. It says, through ongoing conversion of our hearts to Christ, we come gradually to experience sexual desire as the desire to love as God loves, freely, totally, faithfully, and fruitfully. This means we can experience, blank 3, the redemption of our sexual desires, right? The redemption, not the suppression of our sexual desires. Jesus' command is not about suppressing our desires. It's about ordering them rightly. And so the redemption of our sexual desires. And really part of what marriage is a whole process by which God orients us away from selfishness toward our call to give ourselves to the other. That's what we mean when we talk about redemption. And the issue becomes a heart issue, right? It's not an issue of desire, it's of what we desire and what we want in our hearts. When that happens, number 3, when we experience that reorienting, it can lead us to freedom. As it says, liberation from lust sets us free from the law. But here's where we have to define what we mean by free from the law, right? So in our culture, we have 2 different visions and competing visions of freedom. One that says freedom is the freedom to do what I want, what I would call unrestrained license. And then there's another freedom, which is the freedom to love, the freedom to do what is good, true, and beautiful, the freedom to be who I was made to be, right? And you see those competing sometimes. Like, for example, anybody listen to country music? Anybody? I mean, like real country music. I'm not talking about Luke Bryan, okay, or Sam Hunt, or Florida, that god-awful Florida Georgia Line. No, I'm just kidding. I get in these arguments with my daughters sometimes. I'm an old crank, you know. But I love country music. And a number of years ago, I was driving down the road, this is probably actually a couple of decades ago, listened to this song that had come on the radio by a guy who walks that tightrope between authentic country and poser country, depending on the song, Kenny Chesney. And so I'm rolling down the road, and I hear this song come on country radio, never heard it before. It has a real catchy chorus. And it says something like this: so I'll just sit right here and have another beer in Mexico, right? And you know, I heard that song and got into singing it, and I thought, man, this is what we need in country music, is another drinking song. We don't have enough of those, right? But the more I listened to that song over the next few weeks, I realized there's a lot more going on in this song than you think. He's talking about how he's at a crossroads in his life, and he kind of can't make a decision about his future. And so he's paralyzed by it. And rather than make a decision, he's just going to sit right here and have another beer in Mexico. Sounds like a pretty good plan, right? And then you find out what his crisis is. He says this in the bridge of the song: maybe I'll settle down, get married, or stay single and stay what? Free. I'll settle down, get married, or stay single and stay free. Well, you know what? Maybe sounds cynical. Depending on what you mean by freedom, he's not wrong. Because if your vision of freedom is the freedom to do what you want, marriage is the enemy to that freedom. Do you think I'm exaggerating? You know, I'd love to go this weekend, but better check with the little lady. Or, oh yeah, I'd love to get together and go with you this weekend. I'm not sure, but I better call my husband and see what we have planned. You ever see the what's that image? The most common image that we have for marriage, and that sort of thing. Ball and chain. Does that sound familiar? You know, you ever watch Seinfeld? Kramer, that time he says to Jerry, he said, "What are you talking about, Jerry? Marriage, family? They're prisons. You're doing time. You go to bed at night, she's there. You wake up in the morning, she's there. It's like you have to ask permission to use the bathroom. Is it all right to use the bathroom now?" If that's your vision of marriage, let me do you a favor. You can sort of go ahead and end meeting and cancel the plans. Don't get married, because you'll find marriage is a big restriction on that freedom. But what if freedom is something else? And if what we propose is a vision of freedom that's beyond doing just what you want? To illustrate it, I'll tell you that an example from my own way. Lo, those many decades ago, I was there at this Methodist church. The pastor was behind me. All my groomsmen behind me. I mean, the pastor was there, yep. And then we started the whole rigmarole, right? The grandmothers are seated, the mothers, and the bridesmaids come down one at a time. And then the ring bearer and the flower girl. And then the doors close at the end of this long center aisle. The organist changes the tune, I think trumpet voluntary. The doors open back up, and there's Angie, looking spectacular. She's there with her father, and she starts coming down the aisle toward me. And she gets about halfway down, you know, my heart's toom, toom, toom. She gets about halfway toward me, and I can see that even though she's smiling, she's crying. Tears are rolling down her cheeks. And I'm thinking to myself, it's not going to be that bad, sweetheart. Just hang in there with me. But as she gets toward me, I don't remember everything about that day, but I can tell you what I wasn't thinking. I wasn't thinking, oh, here goes my freedom. I can't believe I'm giving up my freedom to enter into marriage. In fact, what I would say is actually the very promises we made that day were the very expression of our freedom. Freedom rightly understood, the freedom to love. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong impression. I'm far from a perfect person. I still have some Kramer in me, 31 years of marriage later. And because marriage has been a journey of trying to turn me away from a Kramer understanding of freedom and love to what Christ is calling me to. But that's the beautiful thing about what freedom in its most authentic way is about. As it says here, Christ did not come to give us more rules to follow. He came to change our hearts so that we would no longer need the rules. In effect, Christ says, you've heard the commandment not to commit adultery. The problem is you desire to commit adultery. Here's when the gospel becomes the good news. If we let him, Christ can change our hearts to the point that we become free from the law, not free to break it, but free to fulfill it. So, Charles and Ann, I'll pick you on you this time, actually just more like Charles. So to illustrate this, Charles, I will ask you a question, and you need to answer this honestly, okay? Have you ever been tempted to murder Ann?
No.
Oh, that's good. That's good to hear, Ann, right? It's not something you struggle with. You don't have to like put a Post-it note on your bathroom mirror, don't murder Ann today. You don't have like a small group of friends who, you know, hold you accountable, call you up and say, dude, don't do it. You know, prison's not worth it, whatever. It's not something you struggle with.
It is not. It is not. Thankfully, that is not something I struggle with.
That's good. So I would ask everybody, you think about the 10 Commandments, and there's that one, right? Thou shalt not kill. You think we can expand that to say, thou shalt not kill thy fiance? Do you agree with that? So let me ask you this. Is that a good commandment? And my next question would be, does Charles need that commandment? I would guess.
I would say it is a good commandment. I don't think I need it. I think I could probably come to that conclusion by my own reason.
Right. And because you don't want to kill her, right? So that's, I mean, here's what I'm saying is, right, even though it's a good law, you're free from it. Not free to break it, but it doesn't in any way impose upon you, right? Because your heart is already in conformity with it. Here's what I'm trying to say. Look, we only resent God's plan for marriage in those areas in which we desire to break God's plan for marriage. And marriage is more than about simply not murdering your spouse, right? It's about living in that fullness of love. And we're going to find as we go through married life that there are times in which God's plan for marriage feels like a burden to us. And what do we do in those instances, right? Well, sometimes we think what we do is rationalize what we do and bring the law down to meet us where we are. But that's really an inauthentic way to experience freedom. Freedom is saying when we have this gap between this is what God wants and this is how I'm living. And by the way, we'll have this gap until you die to varying degrees. That's why we have confession, right? But how do you close that gap? It's by saying, God, take my heart and change it so that more and more reorient my love away from myself only to the love of my partner. And therefore, God, lead me into the freedom of living your plan for marriage. And that is the most authentic way. That's what marriage is intended to do, to help us experience real freedom. As it says, true freedom is liberation not from the external constraint that calls me to good, but from the internal constraint that hinders my choice of the good. Now, number 4, the good thing is that when we experience this freedom from selfishness, it leads us to a deeper reverence for Christ and for each other. And I'm going to have, let's say, I'll ask maybe Jenny if you'll read this verse from Ephesians that starts, be subject to one another. But I'm going to pause you, because this is actually one of the more controversial passages in the whole New Testament in terms of marriage relationships. At a certain point, about halfway through, Jenny, I'm going to stop you, and I'll let Spencer finish the paragraph. So if you'll start reading there from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians.
Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, as the church is subject to Christ. So let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands.
You stop there. Woo! That's a good one, isn't it? Wives, be subject to your husbands. You know, this reading comes up in the Mass every few years in the Catholic Church. If you're ever in a Mass and you see that being read, kind of look around and see how many husbands give a little gentle elbow into the rib cage of their wife. You hear that? It says it right there in the Bible, sweetheart. You're supposed to be subject to me. Makes the hair on the neck, back of the necks of the women stand up. Why is that, right? Well, Pope St. John Paul II said the reason that the hair on the back of the neck stands up is because we're reacting to a fundamental misunderstanding of this passage, right? So some translations talk about submission, right? Wives, be in submission to your husbands. Well, let's think about the word submission. We know what mission means. What does the prefix sub mean? It means below, right? So you could say, okay, wives, bring yourselves under the mission of your husband. Well, that doesn't sound a lot better until we ask the question, what is the mission of the husband? So Spencer, you can finish out where Jenny left off.
Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her.
Wow. So you want to see a picture of your marital mission, men? It's right there. That is your marital mission. Complete and utter abandonment and sacrifice to your beloved without condition. That's a pretty daunting mission. But as we see here, according to this analogy, the wife is a symbol of the church and the husband a symbol of Christ. Christ came not to be served, but to serve, to lay down his life for his bride. He's not justifying male domination. Actually, as we go back to the beginning, The woman formed from the rib, it's meant to be a partnership equal in dignity from the beginning, right? This is a result of sin. But St. Paul is talking about restoring the original order before sin. And so when St. Paul calls wives to submit to their husbands, he's saying, in essence, wives, allow your husbands, blank for, to serve you by pouring their lives in love and care for you. Allow your husbands to serve you. In other words, we've gotten the thing turned completely upside down. Now, men and women have their own distinctive qualities, and sometimes maybe that service and submission looks different in each, but as you notice at the beginning of that passage, it says, be subject to one another. So there is a mutual submission, but that's really the path to genuine freedom and respect in married life. Jump ahead to page 15. How do we live a redeemed marriage? If the source of all the problems of man and woman's relationship is the fact that we have doubted God's love for us and turned our back on them, then what would the solution be? We must, blank 5, we must return to God. Christ's first words of his public ministry were repent and believe in the gospel. Repent simply means turn around, change your mind, be different. We must invite Christ into our lives as our Redeemer and allow him to convert our hearts. We must say yes to God's marriage proposal. And as members of the church, we must submit to Christ as our bridegroom, abandoning ourselves to his love for us and pledging our love to him in return. This means spending time with Christ in daily prayer, getting to know him by reading his word, and living a, blank 6, sacramental life. A sacramental life. What does that mean? It means embracing the faith we received in baptism, being reconciled to Christ and his church when we fall through confession, and being fed each Sunday, and more often when possible, in the Eucharist. One of the things that I really like about the sacraments in our whole Catholic economy is that where they come sometimes as our lives unfold. And so, for example, they become for us an invitation to go deeper in our faith, or even to return in some way to it. I remember when I was a kid, we used to go every year, my family, to Florida during spring break, and sometimes we'd go to the east coast of Florida, and where the surf was stronger. And we'd go down there to the beach, and my parents were old school, right? Their job wasn't to get buried in the sand or build sand castles. It was to fall asleep on their towel while my two sisters and I played in the water. And so we'd go in there, and they'd oil up and fall asleep, and my sisters and I would go down and, play in the waves. And after we'd done that for 10 or 15 minutes, we'd kind of look back up onto the shore to get our bearings, and wait a minute, when we left, Mom and Dad were there, now they're there. What happened? Did they pick up their towels and books? And no, of course not. We drifted imperceptibly by the power and the strength of the waves. We were pulled little by little away from them. And sometimes in our faith, we can have the same experience. It's not that we are at a distance from God out of some great act of defiance. Maybe we've just drifted internally, exteriorly, whatever. We can find ourselves at our distance. Preparation for something like the sacrament of marriage is really an invitation to go deeper into our faith. And if we find ourselves at a distance in some ways, it's a doorway to walking in that grace and in that light. And so I really encourage you during this season of preparation in your life to allow that to be the case for you, because God is always, no matter our age or stage, he's calling us back to himself. What we're going to do now is we have a couple pages. We're going to do a individual reflection and then a discussion as a couple. So your opportunity to reflect on what you've heard so far, to think about it, and to think about it in its application in your own relationship, right? So what you're going to do in just a minute, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes or so, and I really would encourage, 8 or 10 minutes, I would encourage you to give each other adequate space. That'll be easy for Ann and Charles, Jenny a little bit, and Spencer, just a little bit of proverbial space from each other so that you can individually reflect. And the questions are rather general, like number 1, what struck you from this session? Number 2 asks whether you've really thought about the role that your faith will have in your married life. And then the number 3 question is, what do you think about saying yes to God's proposal and entrusting your life and marriage to Christ? And what feelings does this idea conjure up in me? And maybe several feelings at the same time. And then the next page is a list of what we would call honest prayers, meant to reflect different places that people may be in terms of their faith or lack thereof. Read over those prayers and say, man, maybe is there one that best expresses where I am right now? And so here's a couple of things that I want to say about this whole process is everybody's different. Some of you get something like this, give you a pen and some reflection questions, and you could write a novel. For others of you, this will be like a root canal. And here's what I want to say. Give it your best shot. For the sake of your fiance and for your own sake. You don't have to write a novel, but really engage with these questions. And then, you're not turning these in. We're not mailing them to the bishop or to your parents. These are for your own reflection. But after you have that, after about 8 or 10 minutes, I'll give you a signal. And then you could take about 10 minutes as a couple to talk about these things together, your thoughts. And, one thing that I want to encourage you not to do, hold on, let me grab it really quick, is to really kind of rise above the use of that as a distraction in the midst of this, because I know, believe me, I get it. And, the more we use these things, our attention spans shrink proportionally. I want to encourage you, unless you're like an EMT on call or something, to set this aside, unless you're using it to talk to each other, and not to rush through this, and to really, again, see this as an opportunity to reflect on these things together. Fair enough? Okay, we're going to be moving on to session 3. What are you saying I do? Basics of marriage in the church. This is number 21, page number 21. This is the chapter that I call the full disclosure chapter, in which we really talk about what it means to be married and what marriage is. I think about it this way sometimes. There are a lot of different ways that you can answer the question, will you marry me? You could answer it yes, obviously. Here you've gathered that somebody answered yes to that question, but you could answer no. You could have to say, I need to think about it. But I bet you've never known anybody who answered the question, will you marry me, like this? It depends on what you mean by marry. That's marry with 2 R's in the middle, right? But in some ways, it's not a bad question to ask, because as we've already seen with freedom and love, there are words that have different meanings depending on who says them, right? And so when we say marry, what does it mean to marry? Particularly in understanding what we mean in the Catholic Church when you say marry, because for the sake of our own integrity, it's important to consider what we're committing ourselves to, right? And so we're going to look at the definition of marriage from the Catholic perspective, and what it means, and how we want to apply that in our situation. So what we're going to read is a definition of marriage in your workbook here, that's drawn from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and also CCL, that stands for the Code of Canon Law. Canon, not with two N's and just one N in the middle. It's not something we blow up things with. The canon is the sort of standard or rule of practice. And the reason we want to look at this is it says God himself is the author of marriage, and we're not free to change it at will. It's only marriage to the extent that it conforms to God's design for marriage. So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to read this paragraph 1a, and I want you to have a pen in your hand. And going back to high school literature again, you know, if you recall, annotating your readings, right? So anything that stands out to you, underline, circle, put a box around it, star, whatever. I want you to pay attention as I read this definition of marriage. And I want you to note anything that stands out to you. And I'll explain like this. Either something that you find enlightening or inspiring, or something that is confusing in the definition of marriage that you want some clarification about, or even maybe something that you see sets apart the Catholic definition of marriage from some other definitions of marriage within our culture, whether that's civil marriage or even other faith traditions. All right, so here we go. Marriage is the intimate, exclusive, indissoluble communion of life and love entered by man and woman at the design of the Creator for the purpose of their own good and the procreation and education of children. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. Anybody have a word or phrase for whatever reason that stood out to you in that paragraph? By the way, just to remind you that there is a chat feature. You know, if you ever want to say something in written form in the midst of this, you can do that as well. Anybody, a word or a phrase that stands out to you?
I underlined procreation.
Okay. Why did that stand out to you?
I feel like that's like different about getting married in the Catholic Church. Maybe like some people get married and they like say they don't want children, but I feel like that's a big part of the Catholic Church is being open to having children. Yeah,
that's a great point. And I like what you said there. It's about being open to having children, not necessarily the ability to have children, right? Because you could be past childbearing age, or you could have, from no fault of your own, you know, struggles with infertility. But it's about being open to new life. And here's an interesting thing that I didn't learn this until many years into marriage. The reason in the Catholic vision that openness to life is intrinsic to the meaning of marriage. It's not an add-on. It's not something that, you know, is optional or nice. Openness to children is intrinsic to the meaning of marriage. And it's really related to this idea that marriage is a sign of who God is as a communion of love. And we think about that, well, okay, God's three, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you know, at the Trinity. Marriage is two, so it's not really a perfect sign, but we need to think about it like this, right? The Trinity is hard to understand, but here's one analogy, imperfect, but not bad. Think about the Trinity like this. The Father loves the Son. From all eternity, the Father loves the Son. The Son, from all eternity, receives the Father's love and reciprocates that love upon the Father. And the love between the two of them is so infinite and eternal that the love between the two of them is actually a third person, the Holy Spirit, who, as we say in the Creed, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. We're in this great weekend of Pentecost and the gift of the Holy Spirit, right? Now think about marriage, a sign of that Trinitarian love. Husband loves his wife. He pours his love upon his wife without holding anything back. The wife receives that love and also pours her love upon her husband. And the love between the two of them is so infinite and eternal, because that's what love is, that the love between the two of them, where God's so gracious, can become a third person, a child who proceeds from the husband and the wife. And so that marriage and the family become a particular sign of who God is as a communion of persons. And so at the heart of our understanding of marriage is this openness to generative, fruitful love. Now notice, it says in the phrase, it's the procreation and education of children, right? So it's not just popping them out like Pez, it's having children and raising them up in the faith. But it's meant to reflect who God is. Any questions about that? Anybody else have a phrase or word that stood out to you? Jenny pointed out how this definition maybe is definite in that area of children with the civil definition. So that could be a reason, or in terms of what you point out, or something that you like, or that you're confused about.
I liked the phrase communion of life and love.
Oh yeah, what did you like about it?
I don't know, I just like that, I guess, perspective of what marriage is. And that stood out to me the most. But
I like that, yeah, because we talk about the institution of marriage, which sometimes can feel sort of sterile and like it's just like a building or something, but it's when it's something's a communion, it's something that's living and it's organic and it's a reality we live in, hopefully with life and love. It's good. And anybody else? Anybody that word? What do you think that word indissoluble means? Do we have any chemists?
Definitely not a chemist, but I would say it means it can't be broken down.
Exactly. Yeah. And notice, it's not that we're not able to break it down. It's that you can't. I mean, once these two elements or whatever became united, they can't be separated. And so, do you think the civil government has that view of marriage? No, absolutely. The marriage is dissoluble. In other words, the same judge who ties you together with the stroke of his pen can untie you. And in the Catholic understanding, once you are bound to someone in the marriage bond, it's an indissoluble, actually there's only one thing that can break that bond in the Catholic understanding. Any guesses on what that is?
death.
Death, exactly. Now think about it. Now I just, ponder this for just a minute, right? Think about the person that either you're sitting next to or virtually sitting next to. The person that you're going to make these vows to. Think about that person. That they are choosing to irrevocably give themselves to you, no matter what may come. As long as they have breath in their bodies, they're binding themselves to you. That's an amazingly privileged position. And it's also sobering, right? Because we think about it like this. You don't know who your spouse is going to become. And you don't really know for sure who you're going to become, You may become a saint. You may become an asshole. I mean, and anywhere in between. And this promise is an unconditional gift of yourself. And it relates really to that word that we have toward the end of that definition that C word, covenant, which is more than a contract, right? In the civil government sees marriage as a contract, right? And in a contract, you have basically the exchange of goods and services mutually agreed upon. And if somebody breaks their promise, then the contract can be voided. So, with the proper process. A covenant is more than a contract. It's not an exchange of goods and services. It's the exchange of persons irrevocably to each other, And notice, it talks about the sacrament of marriage. The Catholic Church does not presume to have the copyright on marriage or that marriage was created by the Catholic Church. Marriage existed before the Catholic Church. The marriage existed before Judaism. It's a human reality. And so the church gladly recognizes genuine marriage, whether it's two atheists on a golf course or two Buddhists in the Buddhist temple or whatever. But what makes the sacrament of marriage different is that it's not just a natural reality, but it becomes a sacrament through our baptism. In other words, it's not just, you can even two Baptists, right, who are both baptized. They have a sacrament of marriage. They don't have to be Roman Catholic, right? And so it's your baptism that is the doorway into the sacraments. And, when my wife and I entered the Catholic Church, we've been married 17 years. And we didn't have to have our marriage blessed by the church. The church says that even though we wouldn't have used that word, we had a sacrament from the beginning because we were both baptized Christians when we were united. And so that's an important thing to remember, right? Marriage is a universal human reality, but when we share it as a sacrament, it becomes an avenue of supernatural grace, which is a great gift. Any other words or comments? Or any phrases? Notice I like that phrase, for the purpose of their own good. So marriage is not just oriented toward being open to children. It's also for the purpose of your own good. Now think about that cosmically, right? What is your ultimate good? Your ultimate good is joy in this life and the joy in the life to come. And so your ultimate greatest good is life with God forever, starting now and then consummated in heaven, right? And so marriage is meant to be, it's one reason we call it a vocation. It's like a school that prepares you for what your ultimate destiny is. And so I've heard it expressed this way. The purpose of marriage, your purpose as a spouse, is to get your spouse to heaven. Now, if you get to heaven as a result, all the better. But your primary concern is, how can I, through my love of my spouse, help my spouse get to heaven, which is our ultimate good. I think that's a beautiful thing to contemplate. The last thing I want to mention, everybody was very polite and didn't mention maybe the most explosive phrase in that definition as of maybe about 5 years ago in our Supreme Court in what marriage is by its nature. What phrase do you think I'm talking about?
Between a man and a woman.
Between a man and a woman, right? Now, that is some people find that idea very offensive. And I understand that. And what I want to do is I want to hit the pause button on that. And a little later in this chapter, I'm going to come back around to that, because oftentimes when we think about something more thoroughly, we at least have a better understanding of why this is intrinsic to the Catholic vision and understanding of marriage. So just hit a pause button and we'll come back to that. Let's go to number 2. What makes marriage a sacrament? Sacraments are visible signs of the world that communicate God's invisible mystery of life and love to us. Sacraments, you might say, are where heaven and earth kiss and where Christ becomes one with his bride in and through our flesh, right? So think about us, we all have this stuff, this flesh. We have these bodies. And in our Christian understanding, our bodies don't just house our souls. We are actually profound union of body and soul. Therefore, God made us material beings. He made us out of matter. And so when he shares his grace with us, he does it through our bodies, through our senses, right? This is why if you go to Catholic Mass, it's a very sensual experience, properly understood, because it's God speaking to us and sharing his grace with us through our senses, the sounds and the smells of the Mass, or the water that washes our bodies in baptism, or eating and drinking the body and blood, or speaking words of confession. These all are a part, this is why Catholic Mass is like Catholic calisthenics, you're standing, sitting, kneeling, all this stuff, right? Sacraments are part of how God communicates. And the purpose of the sacraments is to unite us with Christ, our bridegroom, in an eternal, life-giving bond of love. Marriage, then, is not only one of the 7 sacraments, but according to St. John Paul II, it is in some sense the prototype of all the sacraments. That's blank 2. The prototype. In other words, all the sacraments have a marital meaning. Here's a great quote. This is from the Catechism. The entire Christian life bears the mark of the spousal love of Christ and the Church. Already baptism is a nuptial mystery. It is, so to speak, the nuptial bath which precedes the wedding feast, the Eucharist. What do we mean? Let me show you something really quick to help us understand. I want to show you a picture that's near and dear to me. It's from 7 years ago. This is our youngest daughter, Zoe, and this is at her wedding. Actually, I'm not part of a religious cult, so that it's not actually her wedding. But what is it? What is a picture of, you think? It's her first communion, right? But how's she dressed? Is there any other time in her life that she might dress like that? Absolutely, at her wedding, right? What's the connection? Not just that it's a very precious photo op that I can break up on my computer and bring tears to my eyes. What's the connection? It's because the Eucharist, by its very nature, it's a marital meal. It is Christ giving him his body through his bride, the church, right? It's Christ giving his body to his church. Think about it like this in terms of your own wedding. Those words that Christ says at the moment of consecration in the Mass, "This is my body, which is given up for you." Those are actually words that you could say to each other in the honeymoon suite on your wedding night. "This is my body, which will be given up for you." The words of the Eucharist, the receiving of the Eucharist, is a great marital sign. And we can say that about the other sacraments as well. Now let's talk about really quick about, actually I'm going to go back to the screen really big. Not so we can look at my daughter, Zoe. She'll kill me if she knew I was sharing this. She's that age, 14. Anyway, every sacrament has 3 things. It has a proper minister, form, and matter. So the minister is who celebrates it, the form or the words and actions, and the matter is the stuff that's used. So for baptism, who's the minister? Well, it could be a priest, deacon, or bishop. Actually, in our Catholic understanding, in a special case or a time of great need, It could be anyone. Anyone can baptize, right? The form are the words and actions. And so to have a baptism, you have to pour water on the baptized person being baptized and say these words. This is my body. I'm sorry. I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And then what's the matter? It can't be, Samuel Adams, and it can't be Yoo-hoo. It has to be water. So for the Eucharist, the minister is the priest or bishop, a little more narrow. The form of the words we just said, this is my body, this is my blood, and the matter has to be bread and wine for it to be the sacrament of the Eucharist. So for marriage, let's go back to marriage. Who's the minister of the sacrament of marriage? Any guesses? Jenny and Spencer, Father Norm will not be the minister of the sacrament of marriage for you. Did you know that? Who's the sacrament? Who's the minister?
The God.
No, well, God's always present in every sacrament. It's like answering Jesus in religion class. But who is the minister of the sacrament?
Is it us?
Yes, the bride and the groom. You are the ministers of the sacrament of matrimony. You don't say, you shouldn't say Father's marrying us. Father's a celibate. He's not marrying anybody. You are marrying each other, right? The bride and groom are the ministers of the sacrament of marriage, which is brought about by the free exchange of consent. The priest or deacon serves only as an official witness for the church. He's there to make sure you don't say 99.5%, right? So what about the form and the matter? For sacraments to be celebrated validly, they must have the proper form. What do you think the form? What are the words that have to be said? The exchange of vows, blank 5, properly witnessed by the church is the form. And what do you think is number 6, the matter? With baptism, it's water. Eucharist, it's bread and wine. What do you think the matter is of marriage? I'll give you a hint. It's not your rings. You can actually get married without rings in the Catholic Church. What's the matter? Blank 6, the very bodies of husband and wife make up the matter of the sacrament of marriage. We're going to come back to that, by the way. Let's go to number 3, the exchange of consent. Now, when you have your wedding, you're going to be asked these questions of intent early in the wedding. And we talked earlier at the beginning of this chapter, what do you mean by marry, right? The purpose of these 3 questions is to establish whether you are there to marry as we understand it. And I put them on the screen here because the ones you have in your book have been changed a little bit. The translation is in the new ritual is a little differently. So I want you to see the basic same idea, but I want to see what you're actually going to answer in your wedding. And one of the things I want you to notice about these questions of intention, as we said, love is free, total, faithful, fruitful. And marriage sums up these characteristics of love. And so when you promise to marry, you promise to love as God loves, these questions of intention reflect those 4 qualities of love. Have you come here to enter in marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly? That's the free and total dimensions of love. Are you prepared as you follow the path of marriage to love and honor each other for as long as you both shall live? That's the fidelity or the faithfulness. And are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? That's the fruitful dimension. If you answer in the negative to either of those 3 questions, it's going to be the shortest non-wedding that's ever had, right? Because the only possible answer, if you intend to marry, is to say yes. And then after that, as it says here in your booklet, the priest or deacon will then say, since it is your intention to enter into marriage, Join your right hands and declare your consent before God and his church. You will then declare your consent. I take you to be my wife or husband. I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and health. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. Boom. The minute you say those words, you are married. The very minute you say them. You know, sometimes we think of a wedding is like a graduation where we're crowning an achievement. But actually, a wedding is entering into something brand new. The power of your words, freely giving consent, creates a supernatural, invisible reality, an indissoluble marital bond. It's an amazing thing. As I said, my daughter got married back in September, Naomi, and she remembered this from her marriage prep, that when you say those words, you are married. So you have to know my daughter Naomi, because she's kind of a firecracker. But in the wedding, she did this when after that moment, there you go. When she, after they said those vows to each other, I looked at her husband, Hayden, at that point, and I'm thinking, gosh, bless your heart. She's all yours now, brother. But anyway, that's the idea, right? So you enter into this marital bond through the power of your vows. But that bond is not yet complete. Number 4, marriage is brought about by the free exchange of consent, properly witnessed by the church. However, marriage is not, here's a long word, consummated. C-O-N-S-U-M-M-A-T-E-D, consummated, which is actually a word that means something. It's not just a euphemism for sex, like, did you consummate the relationship? Consummation means to perfect, seal, and bring to completion. Now, how do you perfect, seal, and bring to completion the bond that's formed through your vows? It's through consummation. In other words, here's the definition. This is going to be the best inspiring definition of sex you've ever heard. This is quote 4a here. This is from the Code of Canon Law. Until the spouses have performed between themselves in a human manner the conjugal act which is per se suitable for the generation of children. Wow, these canon lawyers, they are the last of the true romantics, Can you imagine, a couple of years in a marriage, call up your spouse and say at work and say, hey, sweetheart, I want you to know something. Happy anniversary. And I have the champagne chilling and the candles lit, the dinner on the table and Barry White playing. I can't wait to see you tonight and perform between ourselves in a human manner the conjugal act which is per se suitable for the generation of children. Listen, I don't bear any responsibility if you do something like that for the state of your marriage. But why do they write it like this? Because we have a pretty confused world in terms of what does and doesn't consummate the marriage. Let's break that down a little bit. It has to be done in a human manner. Well, what did God give human beings that he didn't give the other creatures? Freedom, right? So it has to be a freely done act. We've been in this generation of Me Too and the whole idea of sexual consent, which is an important conversation, right? Because to truly be a marital act, it has to be one that is consented by both. So it has to be a free act. And then which is per se suitable for the generation of children. In other words, the only act which can that can result in the generation of new human beings. Sexual intercourse. Top of page 23. Genital intercourse is called the conjugal act or the marital embrace because it's the definitive expression of the marriage commitment. It's a sign that encompasses and sums up the whole reality of the joining of two lives in marriage. When a husband and wife consummate their marriage, the form and matter of the sacrament are united. The words of the wedding vows become flesh. Blank 8. Now, why do we say this is the definitive act of marriage? It's certainly not the only way spouses express their love, right? So you could do the dishes for your spouse as an act of marital love. But guess what? You could do the dishes for your next door neighbor, and you've not violated your marital covenant. But what is the one thing, if you do it with your next door neighbor, you have violated the heart and meaning of the covenant, right? It's the sexual union, the bodily union of the two. That is the definitive express that expresses and sums up, perfects, and completes. In other words, you're going to be saying with your bodies what you said with your lips at the altar. That is the definitive act in which your vows become flesh. So unhit or re-hit the pause or play button on that question at the beginning of the chapter. Do you know why in the Catholic understanding, marriage by definition is the union of a man and a woman? Now understand, we're all free persons and nobody can make you believe anything. You're free to accept or reject this vision. But here's the thing I always counsel people to do. If you choose to reject part of this vision, make sure what you're rejecting is the actual teaching and not just a caricature of it. Does that make sense? And so at the heart of this understanding of why marriage is by its very nature defined and understood as a union of man and woman is at a very basic foundational objective level is because that only a man and a woman can have sexual intercourse. Only a man and a woman can unite their bodies in one flesh in a way that is per se suitable for the generation of children. Sometimes I explain it like this, right? Think about the contraction can't. We use it two different ways. We say can't as you're not allowed to do something, and then the can't as you are not able. So if I say you can't drive over 55 on New Circle Road, well, if you've been on New Circle Road, you know that I clearly mean that you're not allowed, but you certainly are able, right? We may have a big sign that says 55, but we know by experience, you certainly can go more than 55, but you're not allowed. And then can't, we sometimes use it to mean that you're not able. So if I were to tell you, I can't dunk a basketball on a 10-foot goal, I doubt any of you would be thinking, that's a stupid rule. Are they afraid Mike's going to bend the rim? I think you would look at me and surmise I'm 5'7", 200 pounds. I'm not going to be able to, I'll be lucky to get the net, not the rim. So when we say in the Catholic vision that two men can't marry or two women can't marry, which can't do we mean? If we meant simply that they're not allowed, that we have an arbitrary rule that keeps two persons from doing what they would otherwise be able to do, then I think you would rightly accuse the church of discrimination, unjust discrimination. But if it's simply an observation of what they're able to do, based on what our understanding of marriage is, the union of two persons in one flesh. It's not an objective, it's not a judgment on the character of a person or whether or not they're able to give or to receive love and stand with each other. But in terms of what our understanding of what marriage is, they're simply not able to do it. This means the upshot is for you, next bullet point, that every time a husband and wife have sexual intercourse, they're meant to be expressing and renewing their wedding vows. Expressing and renewing their wedding vows. Last little section, we'll hit this briefly. What makes marriage valid? Marriage doesn't just automatically happen by going through a ceremony. You're the ministers of the sacrament. And so marriage only happens when you validly minister the sacrament to each other. Numerous things can and sometimes do impede the valid celebration of marriage, even though it looks like a wedding, right? So have you ever heard of a shotgun wedding? Back in the day, you know, bride's pregnant, her father's there with a shotgun to make the groom be true to his commitments. Well, they could cut the cake and say their vows and throw the rice and all the rest. What's missing? What element of marital love is missing? Freedom, right? There's no freedom. So, but what we would say in the Catholic vision is not all shotguns are so obvious and visible, right? There are things that underneath our outward actions can compromise our intent or ability to give consent. And so a declaration of nullity is not a Catholic version of divorce, but an official statement that a valid marriage never in fact existed. Divorce in the sense of ending a valid marriage is always an impossibility. And so in the Catholic Church, we always presume the validity of a marriage, assuming that the right elements are properly in place. But sometimes you'll have a situation that maybe someone who goes through a civil divorce, and they may say, you know, there was something not right about our marriage from the beginning, either in my intent or the intent of my spouse, or maybe both of us. And so a declaration of nullity is looking at it and just saying, is there something, was there something lacking from the very beginning? And it's what's helpful on our end, though, is to say, what kind of qualities can I cultivate in myself and in my spouse so that our consent is authentic and free? So you look, it says, in order for a marriage to be validly established, the bride and groom must not have not any impediments to marriage. Just by their very nature, make a marriage impossible. And at the bottom of the next page, they list some of those out. We won't get down in the weeds of these. Sometimes they're kind of funny to look at. Like, I like that fourth one. Persons who have brought about the death of their spouses in order to marry. If it got into canon law, there's a reason, right? It means somebody tried that. You can kind of see somebody saying, marriage is only dissoluble by death. Okay, I can work with this. Hey, sweetheart, let's go on a cliffside walk. The church is like, nope, you can't do this, you know. And so you can kind of read through some of those. Back to page 23. You must follow the proper form of the sacrament. Next page. This means, unless a dispensation is granted, you must have your exchange of vows witnessed by an official minister of the church and 2 other witnesses, and that you can't alter the vows. For example, you could not say, I promise to be true to you in good times, but not bad, and only for the next 3 years, at which time we will reevaluate. You must have the proper capacity. So on page 24, have the proper capacity to exchange consent and do so freely and unconditionally. This means if either party is hampered psychologically, or offers consent under fear or duress, or places any condition on the marriage, I'll only stay married if, then marriage is not contracted. Now, one of the interesting phenomenon in our current culture is the number of couples, and I usually on all the marriage prep classes I teach, at least 60%, I would say, are couples who are living together, right? And this is something that's a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of, historically speaking, over the last, let's say, 50 years, the rate of couples living together before marriage have gone up about 1,200%. And it's something that doesn't even have any sort of negativity attached to it in our cultural understanding. And sometimes we think that the main reason the church would be opposed to that is sort of a prudish, moralizing. Somebody, saying, tisk, 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 you shouldn't do that. But we need to think a little bit more, because here's the thing that we're discovering, not just in the Catholic Church, but in the culture as a whole, is that what we presume would make for a better preparation for marriage namely living together and therefore removing so many surprises about moving in together, what we discover is actually the statistics don't bear that out. In fact, and this is from secular sources as well as faith-based, that actually couples who live together before marriage have a higher likelihood of their marriage failing, significantly in some cases, particularly if the decision was made to move in together before the desire to marry, and then we slide into it. So here's the concern that's been raised by those who look at marriages, and particularly annulments, those in the tribunals of dioceses and all that. Here's their concern, is that couples sometimes lack adequate space from each other to ensure that their marriage, the decision to marry, is truly a freely chosen one. Because sometimes when you interweave your lives together in leases and mutual bills and all the kind of stuff that comes, all of a sudden if there are warning signs in your relationship, it's harder to recognize those and to resist that sort of that sort of gravitational pull toward marriage. Sometimes also there's maybe, gosh, grandma and grandpa are really upset that we're doing this. We probably need to marry. So I guess what I would say, I don't know your situations or what your situations will be before the wedding. Here's what I want to say, just gently and really without judgment. Consider how you can make sure that you recognize that need for adequate space from each other. If you are living or plan to live together, consider ways that maybe you could separate until the wedding. I know it's crazy to say that sort of thing, but sometimes you'll be amazed at what can be worked out. But at the very least, we need to make sure that our decision is truly a free one and that we have the space from each other to ensure that we're making that decision for the right reasons. Last bullet point here: consent to what the church intends by marriage. That is fidelity, indissolubility, and openness to children. Fidelity, indissolubility, and openness to children. As it says here, the church holds the exchange of consent between spouses to be the indispensable element that makes the marriage. If consent is lacking, there is no marriage. So let's go on. We're going to do another individual reflection. We'll take about 10 minutes this time. And then after that, you can share with each other. So page 26, first question is rather general. Number 2, why do you want to marry your fiance? Seems like a simple question, right? But it's a good question. Also your chance to score some points, right? Number 3, do you intend what the Catholic Church intends by marriage? Important. Why do you want to get married in the Catholic Church? Be specific as possible. Number 5, the 3 questions in the wedding vows, those questions of intent. It deals with that question, and what do you see? Any challenges in those answering those questions? Yes. So you may not get to all these questions. You may focus in on 1 or 2, whatever you prefer. All right, well, welcome back. We are on the over the top here, and now we're, let's say, downhill, but we're going to talk about some fairly challenging stuff. As we talked about at the beginning of the day, we could frame our time together in those 2 points that that Pope made back in 1930 about the 2 steps that couples need to follow in seeking a joy-filled marriage. First is meditate upon God's plan for married life. You know, why does marriage exist? Why did God create it? And so forth. And then the second part, that's what we've done so far, by the way. We've kind of looked at God's plan for marriage and what it means over the whole, I guess, scope of salvation history, and what marriage is in its essence. And the second point he made was couples should, but with the help of God's grace, seek to conform all their ways of thinking and acting and living according to God's plan, which is always challenging, always more challenging to actually live something else, something to think about it. Now, some of your other marriage prep will talk about some of the things, some other practical realities of living this vision, such as, how to communicate and resolve conflict, and how do you deal with your in-laws, and how do you make a budget and be good financial stewards and so forth. That's not what we really do in this particular class. We're going to be talking primarily about our sexuality, which is, this is marriage is the sexual sacrament. And as we've talked about a little bit, it is meant to be, even through our sexuality, a sacramental sign. And so this whole last section of the day, broken up into two themes, is around the realm of sacramental sexuality, and particularly on this idea of what we would call sexual honesty. Now, that's deliberately chosen as a term, sexual honesty, more than sexual morality, because when we think of sexual morality, it can feel like sort of an arbitrary list of rules and restrictions and a legalistic way of viewing it. When we say sexual honesty, it means how do we live in the truth about our sexuality, and how do we, therefore, how do we embrace that and live it? And sometimes that's going to involve sort of taking a hard look to see how we've been formed to think about our sexuality in the culture that we live in. And so we're going to be talking in this section about sexual honesty before marriage. And then in the last one, we'll be talking about sexual honesty within marriage. And so we're on page, 33, The Joy of Sexual Honesty Before Marriage. And we'll talk about sex, lies, and culture. We live in a world saturated with information about sex, as it says. No one who has grown up in our culture is unaffected by the barrage of sexual images, messages, and innuendos communicated through the internet, TV, movies, magazines, and billboards. So, let's kind of have a thought experiment, because we have a culture that shapes and informs us in terms of how we think about sexuality. So let me ask you a question. We can talk about this for a minute. If the only source of information that a person would ever have in their life about sexuality, if that came from popular media, whether that's social media or TV, music, movies, magazines, whatever, what are some things that they would believe about sex? In other words, a person, if they only knew about sex what they learned from popular media, what are some things that they would believe about sex? And I'll just throw that open. And you can either write it in a message or you can speak. Go ahead, Charles.
Oh, all right. I thought. My apologies.
You could type it in or you could say it.
Oh, say it. Probably that it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
Oh, sure. Used to sell anything. I used to marvel at those risque Hardee's commercials, because I thought, listen, you don't have to make a cheeseburger any more attractive to me than it already is. I don't have to have some model eating it with her juice dripping down her arm, but we'll use it to sell anything for sure. And it's ubiquitous for sure. What else? Surely somebody has something to say. Unless you're living among the Amish.
I was just going to say it makes it look like everybody's doing it and that it's just like such a casual thing.
Sure. Yeah, everybody's doing it, and it's casual, almost recreational in some ways, I remember there's I guess it's still there. There was a store out Winchester Road near the interstate. And you can see the big sign above everything, Hustler Hollywood, which was I guess a store for adult novelty sex toys, basically. And they used to advertise on sports radio a lot, and I'm a big sports fan. And I always hear their ads, and they always had the same forward line at the end of their ads. And it was, relax, it's just sex. And, it was kind of the idea that, hey, listen, don't make a big deal out of it. It's just a game. It's just something for, casual, whatever, as to your point there, for sure, Jenny. So. Any other thoughts? Well, think about that sometime. It's a good thought experiment, because we drink in these messages, and we could probably fill up a whiteboard with the various messages that we hear. Sometimes they're not always bad. Sometimes we see a good message in there, from time to time. But here's the thing, right? Even though we can kind of see through the messages that we receive, and sometimes even see the distortions, it's kind of like a fish doesn't know it's wet. We just kind of live in this world, and part of living in sexual honesty means we have to recognize the distortions, how they've shaped us, and how to seek to help maybe God heal us and put us on a different path. Another question I want to ask you, it says here, all of this has a deep and lasting impact on the way we think of ourselves, the way we view our bodies, how we understand the meaning of sex, and yes, on the way we think about, pursue, enter, and live in marriage. That's blank number 1. In order to experience the true joy of sex as God intends for us, it's important to look at how we've been formed to think about sex by our own families and by society. So let me ask you one other question. How many of you learned about sex for the first time from your parents? Not like that you walked in on them. I mean, they actually sat down with you and talked to you about it. Any of you? Anne, yes?
I think I was given a book.
You were given a book. Was it helpful or horrifying? I think I was 13 and my mom gave me a book, You and Your Changing Body, or something like that, and said, if you have any questions, ask your dad. And it was a little late at that point. If not from your parents, what are some other sources that you learned about sex for the first time?
We definitely had sex ed in middle school, and that was haunting.
Okay.
Haunting.
That was haunting?
Haunting.
Haunting, yeah. What grade, like 6th or 7th?
Yeah, I would say maybe 5th.
And they taught you all the appropriate terminology.
Appropriate. Very clinical. Very clinical.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we have more informal ways we learn at school, right? From our friends, jokes that we're told that we pretend to get, though we don't really. I remember for me, my experience was not that uncommon. I was in 5th grade, I think. I had moved to a new town. And I had this guy that I met from across the street, and we were talking one day, and he said, "You know about sex, right?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You don't know about sex?" And so we actually went across the street to his house. We went up to his parents' bedroom. He got a stool, and he got up in his dad's closet on the shelf, and he pulled down a whole stack of Playboy magazines. And that was my inauguration into a whole new world. I remember that day very vividly. I remember the color of the carpet and the wallpaper, and I remember those images, and this, both the feeling inside that that something was not quite right about this, but also being drawn to it as well, And then I remember, it was all through middle school, hearing the stories of friends and who were with girls and their conquests, whether they were true or exaggerated. Then when I was in high school, moved back to Lexington, and was going with my high school band across the state on a charter bus. and another friend sat down and he said, "Hey, look what I brought," and he pulled this magazine out of his back pocket that was about this big, made Playboy look like Highlights magazine. It was like, whoa, that stuff shaped and formed me. And then late in high school, showing my age a little bit, we got cable for the first time, and movie channels late at night, my parents asleep. All this stuff shaped and formed me. And part of what we have to be is honest about how we've been shaped and formed to think about our sexuality. And we need to think about that going forward. Number 2, signs of a mature sexual love. How are we to distinguish between authentic love and lust? As it says, that quote 2b there says, lust impels people very powerfully toward physical intimacy. But if this grows out of nothing more than lust, it is not love. On the contrary, it is a negation of love. And so here's an important point, maybe the key point. Love reaches maturity when it turns from how the other makes me feel to who the other person is. And this is because every person is totally unique and unrepeatable. That's blank 2, unrepeatable. No person can ever be compared to, measured by, replaced by another. Authentic love is attracted not just by attributes or qualities of a person that light a spark. Now, I want to be really careful and tread lightly here, because I'm not denigrating qualities, because it was some quality or qualities that first attracted you to your beloved. And that's a good thing. That's a gift from God. Anybody want to score some points and share what quality first attracted you to your fiance?
Intelligence.
Oh, wow. Very
I
good.
scored points with that one, Charles.
Intelligence. Fantastic. That good Lexington Catholic education. All right. Anybody else?
I'll fire back with kindness.
Oh, yeah. Very nice. How did you notice it?
Just a very gracious attitude towards myself and others when we first started.
Fantastic. Good. All right. There's only 2 couples, so want to share anything, Spencer?
Yeah, I'd say just the amount of joy that she expresses all the time is just, it's just great.
That's fantastic. Good. All right.
And just like how forgiving and patient he is. I've never seen him mad about anything. He's just always so calm and like level-headed, and I really like that.
That's fantastic. Thought you were going to say his red hair. But you guys are so much more deeper than that. I just thought my wife was really pretty. That was what. And of course, she was dating my friend, so I didn't think more about it. But no, we all have those things, and usually it's a collection of things, and again, that's love in its infancy. When we see some beauty in another person, and we want to draw near to that, that's love is in its infancy. But the thing is that love, to reach maturity, has to go beyond that. Why? Because qualities themselves are limited in terms of they can be repeatable. Right? You can find those same qualities in another person. Sometimes, depending on the quality, you might find it in even greater measure, right? So qualities themselves are not enough to sustain our love. The other thing about qualities is they can change. Sometimes most of our qualities have a sort of a flip side or a shadow side, right? So you're drawn to your fiance because she's so organized and together. But on the flip side, a few years into marriage, you realize she's also kind of controlling and judgmental. Or maybe you drawn him because he's so spontaneous and fun-loving. But oh my gosh, he's so scattered and unorganized. It's driving me crazy, right? The other thing about qualities is that, physical qualities can change, right? There's a thing called gravity. Things can sag, or they can expand, or they contract, whatever. Qualities change. And so our love has to go beyond that. And that's really what marriage is intended to do. As it says, last bullet point on page 33, if love stops here, in other words, at repeatable qualities, a shadow is cast over the permanency of the relationship. And here's a great quote from John Paul II. Only the value of the person can sustain a stable relationship. The other values of sexuality are wasted away by time and are exposed to the danger of disillusion. But this is not the case for the value of the person, which is stable and in some way infinite. When love develops and reaches the person, then it is forever. The person who is the object of lust gradually realizes the sentiment of the other. You don't need me, you don't desire me, you desire only a means of gratification. Far from feeling loved and affirmed as a unique and unrepeatable person, those objectified by lust feel used and debased as a repeatable commodity. This sort of seeps in a lot in our culture, and it's really hard to recognize, and the way that impacts us, and even without thinking about it. I remember a number of years ago, you've heard of Jennifer Lawrence, right? The very talented, beautiful actress. She's a Louisville fan, so nobody's perfect. But, she had sort of a public scandal a few years ago. I don't know if you remember this. She had some, I guess, very personal photos, nude photos of herself that were hacked into on her iCloud account and disseminated across the internet. And she was devastated, of course, as you would imagine. And she was being interviewed about it. And, she basically said in her anger that anyone who shared those pictures without permission or looked at them was guilty of a sex crime. And I think she's absolutely right. But then she said this, when she was asked the question, why did you have those pictures on your iCloud account? Now, it's a free country, right? She's an adult. I mean, she didn't have to answer the question, but she did, to her credit. But she said, I had this boyfriend, and that we lived across the country from each other. And your boyfriend's either going to look at porn or he's going to look at you. And I think I know what she was trying to say, but when I read that, my heart kind of sank a little bit, because I have a daughter that's almost the same age as Jennifer Lawrence. And it made me realize that we have kind of bought into this idea in our culture, and particularly in a culture that is, I think, particularly hard on young women, to think that somehow maybe the best that I can hope for is not really love, but use. And what we really have to do is to really take a hard look at how we've come to understand our sexuality and love in that way. I tell you, when I think about a sort of a counterexample of what really I hope to strive for as a husband and as a spouse, is when a couple that I knew when I was a Methodist minister, it was an elderly couple, John and Ernestine. And they were a really neat couple. They were from Eastern Kentucky originally. He was in his late 80s. She was in her early 80s. They'd been married over 60 years, And when I met them, they were very different. John was a musician. He played saxophone in jazz clubs in the 30s in Lexington. He was just always cracking jokes and so forth. Ernestine was much more reserved. She sort of carried herself with this genteel dignity and beauty, even at her age, And so I'd go over and visit with them, and we'd have a cup of coffee and talk, and he'd crack jokes, and she'd roll her eyes, that whole dynamic. But maybe a year or two after I met them, Ernestine started to show some signs of dementia and then ultimately Alzheimer's. And I watched their marriage through that journey. And I saw John be absolutely committed to caring for Ernestine, no matter what came. And it got hard, she would get confused and wander off into the neighborhood, and he'd go have to find her and bring her back. He had to have help coming in. but he was committed to caring for her. And I remember as things continued over several years, it got really bad. Now she was in her late 80s, he was in his early 90s. And at this point, I was over visiting them not long before her death. And Ernestine was, she was not able to do much. She was in a wheelchair. She couldn't walk. She couldn't talk. She couldn't feed herself. She just sort of stared blankly into space. And John, who was already frail himself, I noticed he had these dark circles under his eyes. And I said to John, you look tired. And he said, well, he said, I get up about 3 o'clock in the morning every day. He said, I do that to change Ernestine's diaper. He said, I don't have to do it, but the doctors have told me that, she could get sores, and those sores could get infected, and that's usually how somebody like Ernestine would die. And I'll never forget, he put his arm around her and he gave her a kiss on the cheek, and he looked at me and said, and I want to have her here as long as possible. Now, I want to tell you something. I was not a Catholic at the time, but if I had been, I would have genuflected right there. Because I knew that I was in the presence of true love, authentic love. You think about it in terms of what qualities did she offer him at that point? She wasn't a conversation partner. She couldn't help around the house. Much of her physical beauty had been stripped away, but he loved her for her own sake. He loved her to her person. And, we talk about how in marriage we're promising to love as God loves. That's how God loves us. He doesn't love us because we go to mass or pray the rosary or help the poor. He loves us for our own sake. Now, I've been married 31 years. I feel like I know more about love now than I did when I started. I'm still in grade school, you guys, compared to that kind of love. But here the beautiful thing is this is what marriage is intended to do, to help us understand what love really means, even what our sexuality means, and to love each other for our own sake. Go on to number 3. What is sexual honesty? Sexual honesty means accepting and respecting the language, that's number 3, language of love that God inscribed in our bodies when he created us in his own image as male and female. It means learning to love as God loves in all of our expressions of affection and intimacy. And above all, number 4, never using another person in thought or action as a means of sexual gratification. It goes on here to say that we all recognize that the body possesses a language and that it's possible to contradict this language, to tell a lie with the body. And 2 examples I give. Let's say you buy a used car and the guy who sells it to you knows that it's a lemon, but he looks you in the eye and shakes your hand. So he's lying with his body. A more poignant example was the night before Jesus died. Judas took the temple guards to go find Jesus and arrest him. They didn't know what Jesus looked like, and Judas said, okay, well, here's how you know who Jesus is. He's the one I'll kiss. And he went up to Jesus and he kissed him. And Jesus said maybe the most haunting thing he said in all the Gospels. He said, Judas, you would betray the Son of Man with a kiss? In other words, what should have been a sign of friendship and affection was actually a betrayal, right? The problem is, the blanks at the bottom of the page is that truth and love go hand in hand. And so lying is a contradiction of true love. It can never be true love to speak a lie with the body. Which brings us to number 4, the joy and the challenge on page 35. Sexual honesty brings true joy because it expresses true love, but this comes at a high price. Sexual honesty presents a serious challenge, particularly in today's world in which sex has been virtually sapped of its inherent marital meaning. I was probably married 17 years or so or around there before I ever really thought about the fact. It's not just that, the classic sort of Christian idea that sex belongs in marriage. It's the fact that the act itself is a marital act. The language of the act is a marital act. In other words, we're saying with our bodies what we said with our lips. And as it says here, because we've all been affected so deeply by society's sexual confusion, coming to understand and embrace God's plan for sexual union is among the most important things you can do to prepare for the sacrament of marriage. It's being willing to recognize. One of the things that I think is foundational in our Catholic understanding is that we're responsible to the degree that we know, right? And so we're not really responsible when we don't know something. But when we know something, we're responsible then, right? And so no matter what's happened to us in the past, as we seek to live in the truth about something with God's grace, we understand and recognize that maybe how can we continue to grow toward the truth? And so the challenge, there's two challenges. The first one bullet point here on 35 says, sexual honesty for the engaged means reserving sexual intimacy until it's an honest expression of the wedding vows to which you've already committed your lives before God and His church. I mean, what's the proposed idea here, right? It's that if the language of the sexual union is marital language, then two unmarried persons cannot have honest sex. It doesn't mean that they won't find some pleasure and intimacy, form some type of bond, but on an objective, foundational level, it will be a dishonest act because we're saying something with our bodies which is not true. Now, I know this is a countercultural idea, but if we really think about the implications of these things that we've talked about, in many ways, the Catholic vision of marriage and truth and love are like a Jenga tower. You ever play Jenga? And you pull out one part of it and destabilizes. When we understand how things fit together, it says something to us, I think, with it, no matter where we've been or what our, prior life has been, when we begin to reconcile and think about these things in light, basically what I want to say, not knowing your situations at all, but just in a love of goodwill and not presuming anything. But I want to really encourage you to reflect and consider, propose to you, that if you have as a couple have been sexually active, that one of the things that you can do, maybe the best thing you can do to prepare for marriage, is to stop and to step back and to reflect further about what we're saying with our bodies. It's also true, I would say, that we know that there's a big difference between actually being married and planning to marry. I don't know if have known anyone who's seen an engagement break up. I've certainly seen it in my close circle of friends and family. And so there's a big difference before actually having given ourselves to another irrevocably, and so certainly just waiting for that. And so something that I just really want to encourage you to contemplate. The second challenge here is the sexual honesty before you marry may mean examining your past in light of the true meaning of sex. It may mean forgiving those who have wronged you, and it may mean asking forgiveness of your future spouse if you were unfaithful, as they say, in advance. Despite excuses we make, somewhere in our hearts we know we're meant to give ourselves sexually only to one person, to our spouse. As it says here, in today's world, many people enter marriage today with memories and wounds from past sexual experiences. And these don't just go away when we get married. They need to be addressed, not dwelt upon. We don't need to, in excruciating detail. And certainly we have to use prudence in how we talk about it among ourselves. But we do not need to just pretend that they go away. But we need to honestly address them in sacramental confession, through healing prayer, and if necessary, by obtaining professional counseling. You know, what I would say in essence, don't enter into marriage with big sexual secrets. I could say that about a lot of things, right? No, don't enter into marriage with big financial secrets. But certainly with sexual secrets that are hidden when they erupt within marriage, which they inevitably do if they're not dealt with, they can bring a level of mistrust and difficulty and hurt, even more so than if they were actually confronted and discussed with prudence and care before we enter into marriage. As it says, when left unaddressed, previous sexual experiences can enter marriage in a form of men and women with an underlying sense of hurt, suspicion, and mistrust. Flashbacks and comparisons can actually cripple a couple from experiencing true marital intimacy. But renewed virginity is possible if we seek a genuine conversion of our hearts. And since we are called to love one another as Christ loves, when a future spouse shows genuine sorrow for his or her past choices, blank 8, forgiveness is the only proper response. And forgiveness here is not just some blithe, superficial dismissal. It's okay, whatever. Forgiveness is hard work, and it involves a decision we make with our will, even when our emotions are not there yet. You know, when I think about my own experience and sexual secrets, you know, when my wife and I got married, we were 22. You know, I was studying to be a minister, and you know, we were pretty serious about our faith, though we were very imperfect, like we are now. And but one of the things that you know, we had this conviction as Christians, you know, that we should save sex until marriage. And I will say that even though we were not perfect in terms of, you know, we struggled at times, but we were able to keep that promise. And I would give my wife more credit for her resolve than mine, for sure. But that was something. But even though that we entered into marriage without having sexual intercourse before marriage, it didn't mean that we entered into marriage without sexual secrets. You know, I told you my experience in 5th grade, and then into middle school, and then high school, and then even into college. I had a struggle with pornography that my wife didn't know about. It was something that I hated about myself, a constant feeling of failure. And like any behavior, destructive behavior, you know, there's a whole cycle of, you know, falling into sin and then regretting it, and then self-condemnation, and then resolve, and then falling back. But I had this part of myself. It was really known only to me. And my wife didn't know anything about this when we entered into marriage. And we were about 6 years into marriage, because marriage didn't automatically cure it, right? And so 6 years of marriage, through some circumstances, my wife discovered this. And you know, I remember very well the day I was actually out of town. I was with some other youth ministers. We were planning a big regional retreat at a hotel. And I got this phone call. My friend, colleague, picked up the phone in the meeting room, said, "Oh, Mike, it's your wife. It's Angie." He handed me the phone, and I heard a sound I never want to hear again. It was her voice breaking over the phone and asking me if this was true. And, you know, sometimes you're confronted with something and there's no more game playing. And I had to say, yes, it's true. And she said, well, you need to get home immediately. So I handed up the phone. I probably had an ashen look on my face, I'm sure. Went to my room, got my stuff, drove to the airport, moved my flight up. And I had this long wait until I saw Angie. And this was in the days before cell phones, really. And so I had this long wait, and you know, there's a reality that when you have something like this in your life, when it's hidden, you can sort of rationalize away the ugliness of it, and then when the light shines on it, you see it for what it is. And I knew I had deeply wounded her, because I knew she already had struggles and issues with self-esteem. Her biological dad died when she was 1.5 years old, and she'd always struggled with things, but she'd had me on a pedestal, and now that was shattered. And so I remember the plane landed there at the airport in Myrtle Beach, where we were living at the time, and I waited, and I was the last one to get off the plane. And finally, I walked up through that little tunnel up into the airport. And this was actually before 9/11, where you could actually meet people inside the airport. When I came out, she was across, she was about 20 feet away from me. And I could even see at a distance that she'd been crying. Her eyes were puffy and red. I didn't know what I was going to do, what I was going to say. I was walking toward her. And as I got about halfway toward her, she gave me the only thing that she could really muster, which was kind of a half upturned smile. And when I got to her and I set my bags down, she stepped toward me and she hugged me. And I'll never forget, I could feel the wetness on my cheek from her tears. And I had nothing to say, but she said, "I love you." She said, "I'm very hurt and I'm very confused, but I love you, and we're going to get through this together. I'm going to forgive you, and we're going to walk through this." Now, don't want to give you the wrong impression, right? That everything was easy peasy after that. There was a lot, and we went to counseling together. There was still a lot of stuff that God was trying to uproot and change in me. But the decision that she made that day saved our marriage. And the truth is, and certainly I pray that never in your married life will you hurt each other in this way. But you will hurt each other. It's just part of being a human being. And the only way that you're going to walk through this together is forsaking secrets and learning to forgive each other, if we're really going to live in honesty and love together. So the last thing I'll say here is, it says, furthermore, although this is often even more difficult, forgiving ourselves for past sexual choices is just as important as forgiving your future spouse, or as I would say, receiving God's forgiveness. If you're Catholic, and if it's been a while since you've been to confession, you really need to avail yourself of the sacrament of reconciliation before your wedding. And believe me, continue to avail yourself of it inside marriage. But the key is going to be forgiveness going forward. Any questions or responses? No, it's heavy stuff. Okay, this is the last time that we're going to do this in this webinar, this thing where you're going to reflect individually and then share with each other. And these are heavy questions, and certainly the idea is not that you're going to get this all talked out, or you have to be prudent and so forth, but maybe at least to bring it up and so that you can come back to it. 38, page 38, number 1, basically a general question. Number 2, how has your family and society influenced the way that you understand sex? And do you agree that sex has a language meant to express the divine love of wedding vows? If not, what do you think it's meant to express? Number 3 asks a direct question of previous sexual relationships and whether they affect the way you relate now to your fiance. Again, you have to be prudent here. Number 4 asks the question, if you have been sexually active, are you now willing to wait with God's help until your sexual expression can be an honest renewal of vows? Number 5 asks a question of pornography, which is even more ubiquitous than it's ever been, and also a struggle with both men and women. And then number 6 asks the questions whether you think it's possible to restore sexual honesty. Why or why not? And you may not get to all these, that's okay, but we're going to take about 12 minutes or so. And then I'll give you about 12 minutes together to discuss individually. But so it's right now, it's 1:28, and we're going to go to 1:40 individually. All right. We're going to move to the last session. Page 43. Really appreciate your patience. Hopefully you can see a light at the end of the tunnel and it's not an oncoming train. At the very least, you can say you've built up your virtue of fortitude, endurance. At the very least, you can, when you go through a difficult time in marriage, you could say, we can get through this. You remember that webinar that lasted for so long and we thought it would never end? We got through that. We can get through this, right? So anyway, we're on page 43, the joy of sexual honesty within marriage. I'll ask you a question, show of hands. How many of you plan to be faithful to your wedding vows? That's good, unanimous. No hesitancy that I could tell. No matter how much of that fourth ring, suffering, still plan to be faithful to your vows? Good. That's good, because that's actually the very first step toward a joyful marriage. As it says here, an unshakable internal commitment to live out your marriage vows faithfully, no matter the cost or sacrifice, is the first ingredient required for a successful marriage. But here's where I want to push you a little bit for what faithfulness means, right? So if you've been married a few years ago, married a few years, and you came home and your spouse said, we have to talk, I've been unfaithful to our vows, what would you automatically assume? That they had the worst nightmare, that they had an affair, right? But is that the only way to be unfaithful to our vows? Remember, we're promising to love as God loves. And when I go to a confession, probably 70% of the things that I confess in confession are my shortcomings as a husband and as a father. Maybe it's short temper, or a critical spirit, or harsh words. All those represent my failure to be faithful to living my vows. But I even want to push you a little bit about what it means to be sexually faithful to your wedding vows. So it's not just about not having an affair. It's trying to seek to live the fullness of what those vows say through our bodies. As it says here, simply getting married doesn't automatically guarantee sexual honesty. For example, if spouses are just going through the motions and don't mean what they say, or worse, if they're in some way trying to cancel what their union means, they're being sexually dishonest. Pope St. John Paul II wrote this: the spouse's effort to make their sexual union a faithful expression of their marriage commitment presents the internal problem of every marriage. In other words, how can we make sure in our sexual expression that we are faithfully speaking the language of married love? And so all questions, should be seen as a misprint in the workbook. It should be all questions of sexual honesty, not morality. Come down to one basic question. Is this an authentic sign of God's free, total, faithful, fruitful love, or is it not? In other words, does this faithfully express the wedding vows or not? And so we take just a minute to look at those four qualities of love, and each one in turn, what is something that could be compromising of the language of marital love in our sexual relationship within marriage? Freedom. Again, love had to be love. It has to be free, right? So what could compromise that? Well, certainly in an extreme situation, any sort of physical coercion in the sexual union, which I certainly pray would never be the case. Rarely, and it doesn't happen in marriage, but I've known situations. But coercion can sometimes be more subtle than that. Do you think in married life, the sexual union can sometimes be a bargaining chip, or withheld as a punishment or granted as a reward. Talk to some married couples, they'll tell you that they've seen that experience. I have some friends that married couple, early in their, maybe 5 years into their marriage, the wife was frustrated with her husband because he promised to paint the upstairs hallway, but he hadn't. And she was kind of complaining to a friend of hers on the phone, and her friend said, well, you know how to get him to do it. Just throw some love his way. And she sort of chuckled for a minute, and then she thought, I'm not sure I like what that makes me. Or sometimes it's kind of like, well, if I don't give in, I'm going to get the silent treatment for 3 days. So, okay. We have to be really careful about the integrity of our consent, and that our sexual intimacy is always a free expression. And we always recognize that and respect that in each other. There's another aspect of freedom when we treat our sexual expression as simply as what I'll call a hormonal response that is not something that we can control. So, like, for example, a bad example, a number of years ago, there was a music group called the Bloodhound Gang. And they had this very interesting song in which the refrain said something like this: baby, you and me ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel. It's quite charming, it could be a good first dance at your wedding reception, It's like, what is it that sets human beings apart? It is, they have free will, right? Sometimes we would especially see this in our music, and especially it's often related to how we view men. A man can't help himself. I love Adam Levine, very talented artist. He had a song, though, a few years ago, we're like animals. We're like animals. Well, no, we're not. And we always need to understand that about, sexual desires are good things, but we govern all virtue and action through our reason. How about total? What could compromise the totality of the sexual union? Here's just a hypothetical. I'm sure it would never happen. One spouse is detached, self-centered, and not tuned into the needs of their partner all through the day. Just sort of checked out. And then bedtime rolls around, and the previously detached spouse all of a sudden begins to have romantic overtures, express those. How might the other spouse receive it? I think rightly as a form of use, right? Certainly not a total gift, because if it was a total gift, you would have been tuned in to me and my needs all through the day, not just at bedtime. And so we need to, these are the things that we can, and you can do it in your own way as a couple, reflect on these things, even in your own examination of conscience. How can you continue to grow toward a more faithful expression? How about faithful? Well, clearly having an affair is an exception, but here's where I really want to touch again on this whole issue of pornography, which is a significant problem in our culture, and in marriage. I have a couple of friends who are marriage counselors. Over 50%, they say, of marriages that come to them in crisis, porn is a significant issue. Sometimes we even think maybe we excuse it in ourselves. My spouse will understand. There's profound brokenness that happens in trust and in marriage that has a powerful impact. I would also talk about, just for a minute, your interior fidelity and your thoughts as well. Dynamics like social media, what you share with others, the persons who are not your spouse. There should be, in your relationship with your spouse, areas of your life that really your spouse is the only one who should have access to and jurisdiction. Affairs start sometimes with conversations. And we need to be careful that we don't keep secrets from each other, to talk about how we talk with others who are not our spouse, and that we be vigilant that our interior fidelity, which is where really all infidelity starts interiorly. And so be very, very careful about how we navigate as a married couple through things like social media. And then the last one, fruitfulness. And we're going to spend a little time here, and this probably won't surprise you, but we're going to talk about probably the most countercultural teaching of the Catholic Church. That whole issue about whether marriage is intrinsically between a man and a woman, that's the controversy there is small potatoes compared to this particular one, which is resisted not only by those outside the Catholic Church, but inside the church. And it's this proposed idea. And again, Catholic teaching, it all goes together, right? Like a Jenga tower. But here's the proposal. You ready for it? For a sexual union between spouses to be truly a marital act, then every single sexual union between spouses should be open to life. And conversely, any intentional sterilization of the sexual act, whether temporarily via contraception or more permanently through a vasectomy or tubal ligation, represent reductions and contradictions of the language of marital love. Boom. You talk about countercultural. And the things that I kind of like about that in some ways is it sort of makes us make a decision that either the Catholic Church on this issue is hopelessly trapped in the past, dragging its knuckles and its club into the 21st century, or the Catholic Church is virtually the last remaining institution that speaks sanity on an issue where the world has lost its mind. And we have to kind of choose one or the other. And I'm not telling you which to choose. Again, as I said, if you reject an aspect of the Catholic vision, just be sure that it's the actual teaching and not a caricature of it, and weigh it in light of the other things that we've talked about it, whether it resonates or in any way makes sense. And so I know the temptation when we talk about something like this, because it's a very deeply personal thing, how we steward our fertility as a couple, this powerful thing that we experience, our fertility. And so we're treading on difficult ground here. And the tendency is to just kind of throw the wall up. And here's what I want to encourage you to do. Again, I'm not, whatever your worldview is, I have realistic expectations. But if you struggle with this, all I will encourage you to do is to not close your mind completely, to push that wall down just a little bit, enough to reflect and think, is there some truth here? And so we're going to talk about this just for a few minutes so we can kind of understand exactly what's behind this teaching and the truth of it, or at least from our perspective. The top of page 44 says not just a Catholic issue. And I'm going to give this a short treatment here, because what they do is they lay out here a sort of a quiz game in which several quotes, and you were supposed to match the quote to the person who said it. And what it's intended to illustrate is that we sometimes presume that it's only the Catholic Church who has ever had a contrary position on contraception and its effect on marriage and family and society. But actually, there was a pretty strong cultural consensus among faith groups and even some non-faith groups throughout the history of Western civilization that saw contraception, which has been around for time immemorial, as seeing it as being destructive to marriage and family life. And so they give you these different names, Gandhi, Sigmund Freud, St. John Paul II, Teddy Roosevelt, Dr. Ruth, T.S. Eliot, so forth. And interestingly enough, only one of the persons on that list is Catholic. Can you guess who it is? Oh yeah, St. John Paul II. Not bad. And a couple of those actually were relatively hostile to the Catholic Church. But it's one of the things, and you can look in the answer key in the back. We're not going to go through these one by one. But a couple of things stand out as you read through these quotes. One, there was a concern that was, as contraception became more popularly embraced back in like the 20s and 30s. One of the reasons that was that was expressed about those concerned about it is that the wider acceptance of contraception would lead to a greater sexual recklessness in their culture. So whether or not they were right or wrong, what would you suspect would be the reason that they thought the wider use of contraception would lead to greater recklessness? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Because it takes away a lot of the consequences, potential consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so we, as human beings, we oftentimes react to deterrence, right? So if in Lexington, if the Lexington police came out and said, starting tomorrow, they're no longer going to check for speeders on New Circle Road, would you suspect that the average speed of New Circle Road would go up or down? I think we know human nature, right? It would go up. And so that was kind of the idea. So I think personally, I think it's pretty hard to argue that sexual recklessness has not increased over the last, let's say, 50 to 60 to 70 years in our culture. And I saw an interesting article in Time magazine. Pull it up here. Yeah, this is from 2018. Americans are getting STDs at record rates. Sexually transmitted disease rates in the U.S. are at a record high for the fourth year in a row. All told, nearly 2.3 million cases of chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis were diagnosed, and so forth. I used to do a radio show, kind of a side gig on our local Catholic station. And one time I was interviewing a nationally known author and physician, Dr. Meg Meeker. She's a pediatrician, and she's excellent books on parenting. She's really good. But we were talking about the Gardasil vaccine and that dilemma that parents find themselves in terms of a vaccine against HPV, which can lead to cervical cancer. But in the middle of that conversation, she said, you'd be surprised at what percentage of American adults carry the HPV virus, which is a sexually transmitted disease. 80% is what she said. Now this was, 6 years ago, I guess. And I've had that corroborated by those who are in the medical world that I know. 80% of Americans carrying the HPV virus. I don't know that you can anyway view through that reality through anything than as a consequence of sexual recklessness. Another interesting reality when the pill was invented in 1960, one of the promises of the pill was that it would reduce unwed pregnancies, which were at 5% of pregnancies at that point. Well, now 60 years later, you know what the percentage of children born out of wedlock is? It's not 5%. It's about 42%. And for women under age 30, I think it's the majority of babies. So why would increased use of contraception not have the opposite effect? I would say because contraception is not perfect. You may not have known someone who got pregnant while on the pill, and therefore greater recklessness would bring greater consequences. So that was one of the things that was said. Another issue was that there would be a demographic effect. That once contraception was more widely embraced within a culture, we would see openness to life continue to decline, and it would have a demographic effect. And one of the things, again, one other couple slides I'll show you, is a couple of the things that have been happening, and you can do your own research on this. American birth rates have dropped now to the all-time low. I think this is a couple of years old. I think now it's about 1.73 lifetime births per woman. Now, a culture to repopulate itself, it has to be a 2.1 births per woman, because some children die in infancy and so forth. Now it's 1.73 and continues to decline, and America is far from alone. All the nations in Europe, many countries in Latin America, China, to see the demographic data, it's a staggering thing, because once we've decided that not having children is the optimal situation, that it has an effect on the culture. In Japan, in particular, they are in a real demographic crisis. I think they're at about 1.3. And the problem, of course, is that when you are not having more young people, then there's an inability to support the elderly who depend upon people paying in to support them, right? And so these are the kind of things that we need to think about as we go forward. And you can, again, do your own research. Don't believe me, but look at the number of countries that have to bring about incentive programs, governments incentivizing people being willing to have a child. France, huge cash bonuses to couples who have kids. Denmark had a public service campaign a couple of years ago. You can see the commercials on YouTube. Do it for Denmark. It was encouraging people to have sex and have babies. Of course, the problem in Japan is not just that they're not having babies, they're not having sex, which is interesting with the advent of, pornography and gaming, all this kind of stuff. We're having an impact that I think we're foreseen in many ways by those who criticized contraception, because it was what it does to our mindset. And then the other one is there was a concern about it would later lead to greater objectification of the person. I want to be careful, because every generation has its blind spots, and objectification look different in different generations. How women were objectified. But I think you would have a hard time making the case that women are not more objectified in many ways, at least in our popular media and our culture. All these things went in together and partly explain at the top of 45, every Christian church was unanimous in its condemnation of contraception as harmful to marriage and society until 1930. That's blank 7. At that time, the Anglican Church broke with this teaching and accepted contraception within marriage. Catholics, Protestants, and secular writers predicted at the time that societies which embraced contraception would experience a whole increase on these societal ills. But let's kind of click the zoom button down from the macro picture, or we can talk about societal trends. And it's always easy to dismiss ourselves from those because we're different or whatever, or we have good intentions. But let's look into the interior of your own marriage and how you're going to navigate this challenge of our fertility. How are you going to do it in a way that is consistent with the meaning and the language of the sexual union? And so let's talk about the interior contradiction that contraception has in married life. As it says here, number 3, to contradict means to speak against. Contraception is a contradiction of the very language of marital love. It turns the I do of the wedding vows into an I do not. As it says here, to the question, are you ready to accept children lovingly from God? and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church, the man and the woman? The answer, yes. So what does our yes mean, right? And so, sometimes we think, well, okay, we can be generally open to being generally open to children. Does that mean that each and every act of intercourse needs to be open to children? And in fact, what we would say is, well, on the other dimensions of married love, we would never say, can I be generally open to fidelity to my spouse? Does that mean every sexual union with my spouse has to be with him or her? I think we would say that yes, consistency would demand the language of the act speaks its own words, right? And so whether that's true for fidelity or openness to life. But sometimes we may say, well, okay, free, total, faithful. I've got 3 out of 4, so that's pretty good. But in a sense, the embrace of contraception can, I'm using proposing language here, but when we think about those other dimensions, we see a compromise. So freedom. Again, why was contraception invented at the end of the day? Not to prevent pregnancy, because we already had a 100% safe and reliable way to do that. What's that called?
Chastity?
Chastity, or abstinence. Chastity is like the right ordering sexual, so you could actually have sex and be chaste, because chastity means you're the right ordering. But abstinence means, so that's 100% safe, reliable. Though I did see a black T-shirt a number of years ago that had a silhouette of the Blessed Mother holding a baby, and it said abstinence 99.99999% effective. Rim shot. But unless you were the Blessed Mother bringing forth the Savior of the world, it's 100% effective. So why did we invent and perfect and all these sorts of things contraception? We wanted to be free from the fear of pregnancy or the possibility of pregnancy. But when we understand what freedom really is, right? Freedom is not doing what I want all the time. That's the path to addiction, really. Freedom is choosing the good in every situation, right? What about total? Contraceptive intercourse says, basically, I give myself to you totally, except for this one thing. In other words, I withhold my fertility, which is intrinsically part of my masculinity or femininity. I withhold it, or I ask you to withhold it, yours, from me. And so by its very nature, objectively, no matter what our intent is, it is a language of reduction. And then faithfulness, how can we speak of fidelity when we're violating freedom, total self-giving, and openness to children? So let's go on to number 4. Let's sort of skewer the caricature in the myth. It's a myth that the church teaches that couples are obligated to have as many children as physically possible. So this is what we call the false dichotomy, right? So a false dichotomy is when somebody presents 2 different options and they want you to think these are the only 2 options. And so they'll tell you something like this: either you're responsible with the use of contraception or sterilization, or you become a modern day version of the Duggars and you pop them out like Pez. And these are the 2 options. And so most people think, well, golly, I can't be the Duggars, and so I guess I'll have to choose the other one. But those are not the 2 options. There's another option, right? And that is to be a steward of your fertility in a way that is responsible, but that it also recognizes the language of the sexual union and is committed to only speak that language when I want to speak the truth of it. Here's a great quote: responsible parenthood is exercised either by the prudent and generous decision to raise a numerous family, or by the decision made for serious reasons and with due respect for the moral law to avoid for the time being or even an indeterminate period a new birth. So what could a couple do if they had a serious reason to avoid a child? And here's the thing, the church is, in the Catholic vision, is not going to define to you what a serious reason is. I remember when I was becoming Catholic 15 years ago, I wanted like a laundry list of the difference between mortal sins and venial sins. And it drove me crazy that nobody would give me a definitive list. And because what it is we have to discern our own heart intent and understand what makes a sin and so forth, right? So on even an issue unlike this one, we're trying to discern what a serious reason is to espace or to delay a pregnancy. You're not going to get a definitive list. Now, certainly, I think we could say this shouldn't be for issues of convenience or selfishness. We should certainly tilt toward the generous side, but we have to discern that out. But what can a couple do if they had a serious reason to avoid or delay a pregnancy that wouldn't violate the meaning of intercourse? We could abstain. We could practice periodic abstinence. It sort of connects with this whole way that fertility was designed by God. Fertility has a seasonal dimension, right? So let's say for a man who is fertile, they have a long window of fertility in which a man is pretty typically fertile 24/7, 365, from the onset of puberty through a certain old age. For women, the lifelong season of fertility is shorter, but even within that aspect of fertility, there is a seasonal aspect in terms of, with feminine fertility, every monthly-ish fertility cycle. Emphasis on the ish, with all due respect, right? But there's this understanding that God has built into us seasons of fertility. Periodic abstinence recognizes those seasons and recognizes that there are moments of fertility and infertility that He's placed in our human economy that we can, with seeking to be responsible stewards, we could either abstain if necessary, or we could share in that union, knowing in each time that we have that sexual union, we are open to life. Top of page 47. Here's the principle of natural family planning, or what are sometimes called fertility awareness-based methods. It is acceptable not because it's natural as opposed to artificial. We're all about artificial things like insulin pumps, but artificial means, or in those cases, we work with the body's natural processes, right? But NFP is acceptable because it is in keeping with the nature of sexual intercourse as a renewal of the couple's wedding vows. Never does a couple using NFP to do anything to sterilize their acts of intercourse. If pregnancy does not result from their acts, it's God's doing, not their doing. Every time a couple has intercourse, they can honestly pray, Lord, your will be done. Number 5, a question of faith. Many object that the church's teaching doesn't correspond to our real possibilities. One of the things I think is we can have a sort of academic understanding. We can even see the truth of this. But sometimes the main obstacle for living this vision is fear. Fear that we are going to not being able to provide it for ourselves, or that somehow God is going to curse us with a burden that we can't bear, and so forth. And fear gets in the way. Now, listen, I'm not going to go, I'm going to go ahead and say the elephant in the room, because you're remembering from back in the earlier in the part of the seminar, if you can remember it, where I showed a picture of my family. And you may think, well, yeah, Mike, you're a great poster child for how effective NFP is. with that, Walton's Brady Bunch size family that you've got. But here's what I want to say. Actually, we had all 7 of our kids before we even learned what NFP was. As we say, we got tired of being asked if we were Catholic, so we just decided to become Catholic. When we got married, everybody we knew, and we ran in some pretty square circles, honestly, a lot of people, ministers and people studying for ministry, everybody we knew took the pill. And that was the plan when we got married. We didn't even think about it. We didn't even talk about it. It wasn't even a moral issue. And so we entered into marriage in 1988. Maybe a couple of years into marriage, my wife began to not like the way the pill made her feel. And she also had a history of breast cancer in her family, and she knew that could be an increased risk. And so, not for moral reasons, we went off the pill and we used other means. And we had been married almost 4 years when we had our first child, our daughter, Chelsea. And then 2 years later, we had our second daughter. So 6 years of marriage, 2 kids, that's pretty reasonable. And then we had our third daughter in 97, Mary Grace, Jenny's classmate. That's 9 years, 3 children. Again, not crazy. Around this time, my wife, this was long before we even knew anything about the Catholic Church, she began to have these interior qualms about our attitude toward fertility and parenthood. And she said to me, I think we're not bringing God in on our family planning. And I thought she kind of lost her mind. We had a lot of arguments about it, honestly. Thought she was becoming some sort of fanatic. And so I remember we moved back to Kentucky from South Carolina. We were living in Wilmore for 1 year. I was in a fellowship program at Asbury Seminary, living on a stipend in a small town home with our 3 kids, 5 and under, and getting to working on my graduate degree. And while we were there, after I came home from class one day, after Mary Grace, our third oldest, was about 5 months old, my wife met me at the door holding an EPT test. Pregnant again. And I freaked out. I'm not proud about it, but I freaked out. And I said, so that we were going to have the child because we believed in the humanity of the unborn child. But I told her then, I said, this has to stop. We don't have unlimited resources. After we have this baby, I'm going to go to the doctor and I'm going to get a vasectomy. And she started crying and I stormed off. And I was talking to a friend, an older gentleman, again, none of us Catholic, somebody who was a mentor to me, passed away a few years ago. Older gentleman, just a saint of a man. And I was talking to him in his living room about some other things. And then I told him that Angie was pregnant. And I said, probably going to have to go to the doctor after she has this baby and make sure this doesn't happen again. And this little meek old man looked across the room at me and he said, really? He said, have you talked to God about this? I said, what? And he said, have you asked God whether you're through having children? And he might as well have picked up a little dart and thrown it across the room that went in between my ribs and pierced my heart. And at that moment, I had to admit, no, I hadn't really talked to God about this. And I didn't have this whole full understanding that we're talking about today, but something shifted in me on that day. And when I was standing in the nursery at Central Baptist, holding our daughter Naomi, the one who I showed you the picture, just got married. She's due with our first grandchild in a month. I was holding Naomi and I had this feeling come over me. What are you so afraid of? What are you so afraid of? And, after that, we didn't know NFP. Instead, we practiced QSS, K Sarah Sarah. When you practice QSS, you have 3 more children in short order, which we did, But what I will say to you is, raising 7 children has not been easy. It's been difficult at times, challenging on a whole host of levels. It's the best thing that I've ever done in my life. And when we sat there around at a dinner table with all of our children, we understand that we can't know how trustworthy God is until we have to trust him. And so I just would say, whatever you discern, you may not be called or able to have 7 children. I understand that. But don't live in fear. Embrace God's plan and see it as your path to joy. Really quickly, on page 49, I'm going to hit this in less than 5 minutes. Watch me. Modern methods of NFP are safe and clinically proven to be 98 to 99% effective at avoiding pregnancy. In your binder, I gave you a copy of this article that was in the Atlantic back in 7 years ago. Hardly a Catholic publication. It's for a left-leaning secular, but I think fair-minded. And there was an article 7 years ago called The New Old School Birth Control, talking about fertility awareness-based methods of family planning. And so you can do your own research on this. Don't believe the myths and so forth. NFP can be a very reliable way, if you practice it properly, to manage your fertility. Don't confuse the NFP with the older rhythm method. We're on page 49. Janie and Spencer, welcome back. The rhythm method was a thing. It had some bad nicknames like Vatican Roulette, but it was based on, it was called calendar rhythm. It was based on the assumption that a woman's fertility didn't change from month to month. Now we can know it can change literally from month to month. And so the rhythm method was based on the idea that all you had to do was count days. Now we have, as the third bullet point, we have modern methods of NFP that are actually based on real-time, readily observable signs of fertility present in each cycle. And really, so any woman, regardless of the regularity or irregularity of her cycles, can use NFP effectively. It's in no way contraceptive. It doesn't work against God's creative design, but works in complete accord with it. It's also very effective at helping couples achieve pregnancy when desired. It has no harmful side effects. I don't want to oversell these, but this has been an eventful year for me health-wise. Back last June, I had a first of a series of strokes that I've had over the past year. And I'm doing okay now, but when I had the first one, I was in the ICU at Central Baptist and was talking to a nurse there. I was a little bit discouraged, depressed. You know, I'm 53. I was 53 at the time. Had a stroke, unexplained. And she said, you know, this is a completely unsolicited comment from this Central Baptist nurse. She said, you'd be surprised how many young women we get in here who are on the pill. And I don't think she was saying, she didn't really know what I did for a living. She just was saying it. And it stacks up because I know one of my daughters, when she was an adolescent, went to talk to the doctor about extreme cramping in her menstrual cycle. And they talked about putting her on the pill to regulate her cycles and reduce the pain, which you can do if you're taking it for those reasons. But I know the concern was she gets ocular migraines. And if you get ocular migraines, your chance of having a stroke on the pill is much, much higher. And so you need to be, you know, we're in this age in which we think about the things we put in our bodies. Understand that. But not only that, some hormonal contraceptives can have an abortive effect because it thins out the uterine lining. And so if there is a breakthrough ovulation and there is a human being who is conceived, it'll make the uterus, the endometrium, inhospitable. And it will cause an abortion of sorts, right? This is why women who are on hormonal contraceptives have much lighter periods because of what it does to the uterine lining. NFP fosters authentic marital love and respect, honesty and communication. It fosters trust in God, and in all areas of life, it promotes an authentic marital spirituality and deepens the couple's relationship with Christ and the church. And finally, it is marriage insurance. Surveys indicate couples who practice NFP have a practically non-existent divorce rate. Actually, it's in the low single digits, because the practice of NFP actually cultivate virtues that will be beneficial to your marriage as a whole: self-control, listening, patience, and so forth. And so, we're not going to have your discussion here on the webinar on this issue. I know you are asked to take a full course on NFP. There are different ways that you can do that, different methods, and you can see the brochure for that. I think there was also one in your folder. But here's the thing I want to say. Talk about this issue. Whether it's right now or sometime before the wedding, you need to talk these things through, because I've seen it happen. Don't assume you're on the same page with your future spouse. So I've seen after these things, one person thinking, oh man, that was the biggest crock of crap I've ever heard. And the other saying, I don't know, there's things about that it makes sense. And you can sometimes find the roles reversed. So don't let this become an issue that separates you, but you need to discern together, how are you going to steward your fertility? And I would encourage you, no matter where you are right now, don't shut the door to this proposal. As you reflect upon these things, does it make sense within the whole of what we've discussed? Any questions? I know it's a lot that I threw at you. And I'm always available if you want to call or email me. If you don't, I know this is like a meeting at a faculty meeting, and you're not supposed to ask questions. Well, I know it's been a long day, covered a lot of ground. Hopefully it's given you some food for thought. I want to have a prayer for us. And then I will, as soon as I get done here and in the meeting, I'm going to email you your certificate that you can pass it on to whoever is building your marriage file, the priest or deacon that you're working with. I'll also mail you a hard copy of it that you can have just as a memento of being here today. Listen, I know it's a long day, it's hard. You've at least faked it well, which I appreciate. And I certainly pray God's best for you. So let's have a prayer together. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. God, we thank you for the gift of marriage and for the fidelity of your own love for us that never abandons or forsakes those who genuinely seek you. So I pray for each of these couples. Give them many years together, and if you will, a beautiful family together, and help them through each step in this process of preparation to be fully ready for the yes that they will give at the altar. And we pray it all in Christ's name. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Blessings, and go in peace.
Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.